It's time now, so we would like to start. Thank you very much for joining us today for the International Symposium, Learn About Fukushima and the World Today, Create a Nuclear Future Tomorrow, Nuclear-Free Tomorrow. My name is Fukakusa from FOE Japan. I'll be moderating today's symposium. Thank you very much. It will soon be 11 years since the Great East Japan earthquake of March 11th, 2011, and the subsequent disaster, the TEPCO Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. However, the nuclear disaster is not over, and the damage and effects are far-reaching. Many people have lost their homes, and more than 30,000 people are still displaced. What have we learned from the nuclear disaster? What should we pass on? And what kind of society should we build for the future? We hope that today's symposium will be an opportunity to learn, think, and discuss about the state of the nuclear disaster today, and also about the current global nuclear landscape. This symposium is co-organized by FOE Japan and Peaceport, both international NGOs. The event is hybrid, meaning there is offline and online venue. So there are several speakers and many participants joining us online too. Because we have guests from overseas as well, simultaneous interpretation in English and Japanese is available throughout the symposium. If you would like to change the language you're listening to, please select the language by clicking the globe icon. At the venue, it's going to be all in Japanese. Now, there'll be two parts to today's event. In part one, Muto Roiko will first give a keynote speech titled, "What is happening in Fukushima now?" This will be followed by a series of by a relay talk featuring messages from people in Japan and abroad. We'll then have a short break. In the second part, there'll be a panel discussion with various guests on how to create a future world. During the second part, there'll be time for you to ask questions. If you're attending online, please submit any questions you have using the Q&A function. At the venue, you'll be given a piece of paper on which you can write your question. Again, if you're joining online, please use the Zoom Q&A function to submit your questions. And we'll also be making all the materials available from today's symposium. So please do not take any screenshots or avoid taking photos of the online symposium. Now, prior to the keynote speech, Kanna Mitsuda of FOE Japan will give an opening remark. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mitsuda from FOE Japan. Thank you very much for coming today. And thank you also for all of you who are joining online on Zoom. So it's been 11 years soon from the March 11th, 2011. What were you doing back then in 2011? FOE Japan, our organization, for a week after the nuclear disaster, we had a lot of discussion what we should be doing in the aftermath of the nuclear disaster. What does it mean to really think about the nuclear disaster? How does it mean to work with those who are affected by the nuclear disaster? So we went to Fukushima, and today we'll have many people joining us at the relay talk. And these are the people who we have met through the work we have done after the nuclear disaster. We have worked towards, having better radiation protection guidelines. We have worked on different measures regarding evacuation. So all the people who will be speaking at part one, they are the ones we have been fighting together throughout this period. Unfortunately, we cannot say that the rights of the evacuees are fully guaranteed. The damage from the nuclear disaster also continues to the present day. Many of the harm done is being concealed. So these are the things we will be talking about in part one, to know what is still happening as the after effects of the nuclear disaster. I would also draw your attention to what's happening right now in Ukraine. Russia has invaded Ukraine with military forces. And it's really right now that we have to emphasize how important it is to have peace, to create a nuclear-free future. And this is, I really feel so right now. Me personally, in this climate of crisis, we would like to raise voice. And I'm actually finding it hopeful that many people across the world, including Russian people, are saying that we want peace. But I'm also disheartened by what some people call the shock doctrine. There are people who are saying that we do need nuclear weapons. Indeed, look at the situation right now. We need nuclear deterrence, nuclear capability. And I'm very afraid that this kind of voice is growing. And I think we as people have to resist that kind of narrative. So in part 2, we'll be thinking about what we can do to have nuclear-free future. So we'll have speakers working towards nuclear disarmament, nuclear weapons abolition, and nuclear energy abolition. So these are the themes we'll be speaking about in part 2. And today, I also hoping to learn a lot myself. It's not a short symposium, it's a long one, but I hope to spend a fruitful time with you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Mitsuda. I would now like to move on to the keynote speech. The speaker, Ms. Muto Ruiko, is a representative of Hidanren, the Liaison Committee for Organizations of Victims of the Nuclear Disaster. She lives in Miharucho in the Fukushima Prefecture. Since 2012, she has been working to hold TEPCO accountable as the head of the Fukushima Nuclear Power Plant Complaints Group. The floor is yours, Ms. Muto.
Hello, everybody. I am here today from Fukushima, and my name is Ruiko Muto. I am glad to be able to be here in such a meaningful symposium with you all today. Of course, there is a new war underway now in the world, and nuclear power plants are also under attack. I think we are all sharing these concerns when we are watching the news every day. Today, I will speak to you about now, as we are approaching 11 years since the March 11 disaster, what is happening in Fukushima now from 7 particular perspectives. First of all, about what is actually happening on site within the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant now. Recently, there are many tours or inspections for the regular public at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. But for me personally, I'm somewhat hesitant about participating in these visits. The nuclear site is, of course, still a place where the nuclear emergency declaration is in force, and the disaster is by no means over. The units 1 to 3 reactor lids, it was only last year that it was found that they have, or it was made known that there are high level of radiation. They're comparable to the fuel debris. And also that the vent pipes for units 1 and 2 had been cut off at the base. This was only made clear last year, 10 years after the disaster. What is happening inside the reactor over this time is still so much unknown. Next slide, please. TEPCO, the operators of the plant, have drawn up a roadmap for the decommissioning of the plant in the next 30 to 40 years. But what actual situation will be defined as decommissioning, what the final form will be, is still not decided upon at all. But within such circumstances, thinking about the workers at the nuclear power plant being exposed to radiation, and of course, as this will become more severe in the future as the reactors are being dismantled, I'm very concerned about whether full protective measures and compensation will be properly provided for them. Next, I will speak about the evacuation orders being lifted and about the situation of the evacuees. Since the end of 2014, there has been a lifting of evacuation orders according to the standard which was created after the disaster, which was under 20 millisieverts per year. But the return rate is currently just around 30%. There are different reasons for not returning for the residents, but this includes anxiety about high radiation, inaccurate infrastructure such as hospitals or shops, and also the fact that people have been living in evacuation for such a long time that their lives have become somewhat stable in their new locations. Many of those who do wish to return home are elderly people, but they are concerned, of course, about the inconvenience of living in this area and also about security. At the same time as the evacuation orders being lifted, the compensation and support for evacuees is also being cut off. And temporary housing for residents from the difficult to return zones has also been taken down. In Fukushima Prefecture, there are many different reasons for looking at those people whose temporary housing has been discontinued for various reasons. They've been charged twice the rent, for example, by the prefecture to evacuees who are not able. Some of them have even been taken to court, and there is pressure being put on their relatives as well. Also, another hot topic every year is about the termination of support for medical and nursing care costs for evacuees. 10 years since the disaster, we can see that both the national and Fukushima prefectural governments are working in the direction of cutting off the evacuees. This is evident in the words stated by TEPCO and the government in the compensation trial. We've already made so much compensation and you are still demanding more, is what they say. However, just the other day in the High Court, actually, there was a ruling about actually saying for more compensation being ordered than had been called before. This is, of course, something that should be a natural decision, but I'm very glad that it happened. Next, instead of, well, on top of cutting off the evacuees, at the same time, the Fukushima prefecture is heavily funding people to relocate anew to these 12 municipalities, particularly encouraging young people with up to 2 million yen being granted to them to move to these disaster-affected locations to try and increase the population there. Next, I would like to speak about the release of the radioactive materials. The amount of radioactive material dispersed into the environment as a result of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, if we take in regards to cesium-137, is said to be approximately 160 times that of the Hiroshima bomb. There are today moves afoot to deliberately release radioactive materials collected through the decontamination and also the ALPS processing into the environment. On site, there is about 1.25 million tons of so-called ALPS-treated contaminated water on the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant site. In April last year, the Japanese government decided on a policy of releasing this into the ocean. However, the Fukushima Prefectural Fishery Federation and also the National Fisheries Federation are strongly opposed to this, as are the agriculture, forestry, tourism, and consumer organizations within Fukushima Prefecture. The decision-making process, ignoring the petitions and signatures of up to 500,000 of members of the public and also objections from local governments, is going contrary to democracy. The different public comments, opinion hearings, there have been so many voices of opposition range, both from local governments and from citizens as well, but this is being completely ignored. Not only this, but it also goes against the promises which have been made to the Fishermen's Federation. The Japanese government and TEPCO should acknowledge the failure of the frozen wall and should consider measures to stop groundwater in a drastic different way, including safe storage measures, to wait for radioactive substances in the treated contaminated water to decay. I think this is what they should be doing now. The ocean is the common property of all living things. It is unacceptable to deliberately spread further radioactive contamination any further. And next, I will speak about the situation of the contaminated soil, which has been collected through the decontamination process. There is about 14 million meters cubed of this For a long time, it was being piled up and stored in our living environment, but now about 90% has been delivered to interim storage facilities. From now, in towns such as Futama and Okuma, the decontamination is beginning now outside of the former reconstruction and rehabilitation centers. It's said that there is about 2 million meters cubed of this contaminated soil, but there is no clear plan about when this decontamination will be finished. Other than the designated recovery areas, the decontamination is only being done around houses where residents have already decided to return, which is leaving people in a state of confusion. Next photo, please. The law stipulates that the contaminated soil which is brought to interim storage facilities must, by the year 2045, be removed from Fukushima Prefecture. But in order to reduce that amount, the Japanese Ministry of the Environment has been promoting a plan to reuse the contaminated soil, renaming it as recycled materials in road foundations, seawalls, and even farmland throughout Japan. In other prefectures outside of Fukushima, there are also experimental or testing projects for final disposal in contaminated soil being buried directly into the ground and covered over. There is also something which is being known as disaster waste, where metal is sold, wood waste is pelletized for wood biomass power generation, and incinerated ash is already being reused in civil engineering materials. These different projects are being carried out under what is called the Act on Special Measures Concerning the Handling of Radioactive Material Contamination. But this radioaction control is actually, or looking after, is being left up to regular industrial waste contractors. Within Fukushima Prefecture and its renewable energy projects, there are also several wood biomass power plants which are being constructed. They are claimed to be also serving to decontaminate the forest areas. However, by burning contaminated wood to generate electricity, we are worried that there is also a risk of radioactive particles being spread to the neighboring areas through the exhaust. In addition, this ash is also already being reused as roadbed material. It's also being treated not as radioactive waste, but just as regular waste in regards to how it is being controlled, which we believe is also an issue. In the village of Iitate, a court case was filed by workers at a temporary incinerator facility, claiming that they had been exposed to severe radiation through their work. The temporary incinerator was removed, and there are plans to instead use the site for a biomass power plant. But we are concerned that there is also a possibility for similar exposure by the workers as well. And the TEPCO group is involved in this biomass project. On the next topic, I would like to talk about the health impacts. The Fukushima Prefecture Health Management Survey, which is checking the thyroids of approximately 380,000 children who were under the age of 18 at the time of the disaster, is now in its 5th round of screenings. So far, 266 children have been found with either malignant or suspected malignant cancers. 222 have undergone surgery and 221 cancers have been confirmed. The analysis of the results of the first and second rounds by the oversight committee of the survey declared that they do not accept or do not recognize any link to the nuclear disaster. They say that the higher than expected incidence is attributed to a screening effect. But then 71 cancers were also found in the second round. This would not be the case if it was just a screening effect. Since then, they started to raise the issue of potential overdiagnosis. However, the primary surgeon at the Fukushima Prefectural Medical University, Dr. Suzuki Shinichi, denies this, saying that the operations have all been carried out according to the guidelines. So using this excuse of overdiagnosis is also something that they are using to try and scale back the thyroid screenings at schools. And this has been put to the Oversight Committee several times. However, the 311 Thyroid Cancer Children's Fund, a nonprofit organization, conducted a survey last year of the children and families concerned and found that 90% of the children concerned and 10% of their guardians were of the opinion that the screening in schools should continue as it has been done until now as well. There are many other different issues. For example, It has been revealed through the Japanese Cancer Registry that there are more than 20 patients who are not included in the official number of affected people. Also, the fact that the gender ratio in the incidence of thyroid cancer is different from that of normal pediatric thyroid cancer. And also the fact that cancer has been found in children who are under 5 years old at the time of the disaster. So further investigation and clarification of this, including further surveys and health surveys, is needed as well. The officially stated purpose of the survey includes that the health of the children in Fukushima will be monitored over the long term in light of the nuclear disaster. We very much hope that this will be adhered to. In January of this year, a group of young people who were aged between 6 and 16 years old at the time of the disaster and who since developed thyroid cancer filed a lawsuit against TEPCO. This is an extremely significant case as it seeks to have the court recognize for the first time a causal link between the exposure to radiation following the disaster and their illness, and also to seek compensation for the victims. While this will be a very difficult process, a difficult trial for the children and the parties involved, as adults, we want to be able to support them in some way as much as we can. As well as pediatric thyroid cancer, there are other potential health impacts, but there is barely any research being conducted on this. I do feel that cancers in adults are also increasing in people close to me, around me. Just last year, I lost 5 friends in their 60s to leukemia or thyroid cancer in just last year. Also, the number of so-called disaster-related deaths in Fukushima Prefecture is the highest among the 3 disaster-affected prefectures, with more than 2,300 deaths as of the year 2020. This includes also 118 suicides and 155 deaths alone in disaster recovery housing. So this is, for example, people dying also from other indirect impacts. And there are also reports of high incidences of PTSD and also depression. The next issue is about the propaganda or the information being shared about the recovery of Fukushima. In the year 2014, there was a new Fukushima Reconstruction Acceleration Plan set. And within this is something called the Fukushima Innovation Coast Initiative. Huge reconstruction budgets are being invested in the construction of a series of large-scale facilities for many cutting-edge technology that wasn't existing before the disaster. Some examples of these in the photograph is, for example, on the top right, a robot test field in Minami Soma, a hydrogen energy research field in Namie, a remote technology development center in the town of Naraha, and the International Joint Research Center for Decommissioning in the town of Tomioka. There are also many nuclear-related companies and research facilities there, of course, including TEPCO, where these interests, you can feel them once again circling. The capitalism is taking advantage of the nuclear disaster, transforming the hometowns of the victims into completely different cities, inhabited by completely different people. And so I cannot help but feel that there is an enormous gap between what is happening and the kind of reconstruction that those directly affected would truly like to see. Within the Fukushima the Innovation Coast Initiative is also a new research and education organization, which is using the development of the area around the Hanford nuclear facility in the United States as a model. Students from Iwaki City have been taken to tours of Hanford, and a Hamadori Tri-Deck has been created, which is organized in imitation of the Hanford resident organization Tri-Deck. In addition, at the East Japan International University in Iwaki City in Fukushima, a center called the Fukushima Reconstruction and Creation Institute has been set up. And involved in this is people such as the former president of TEPCO's Reconstruction headquarters, Ishizaki Yoshiyuki, and a former official with the US Department of Energy and the IAEA, Dr. Onishi Yasuo. So in this kind of way, or simultaneously with this, there's a lot of publicity or propaganda being used to create an atmosphere that the nuclear disaster is over. Let's all just get on going forward in reconstruction. The government, ministries and agencies, the Fukushima Prefecture and others have ordered major advertising agencies such as Dentsu to carry out various projects using the television, radio, social media and advertising in a very cunning way to get into people's minds. with different catching phrases and so on. Many of these also target the younger generation. The different centers, such as the Great East Japan Earthquake and Nuclear Disaster Memorial Museum and other education facilities, events, supplementary textbook contexts, pamphlets, events being organized for young people as dialogue forums by the Ministry of the Environment, or also tours of nuclear power stations are being conducted as part of this. The new museum is also partially subsidized by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and within that, the Agency for Energy. And this is part of the project for public information to promote a public understanding of nuclear energy, as it's called. Overall, the project last year had 710 million yen, and this year 1.1 billion yen. As a result of this, it means that even if people feel a kind of anger or anxiety about the disaster or about radiation, it's not easy for them to speak out about it. I think that this is even further linked to this completely neglecting the victims, the loosening drastically the different standards and awareness of radiation protection, the elimination of resistance to radiation exposed work, making the responsibility for the accident ambiguous or blurred, allowing nuclear-related companies, including advertising agencies, to make huge profits and to look at restoring the different control and interests of nuclear power. And I am completely outraged that this is being done with the use of huge amounts of our money as taxpayers. As the sixth point, I would like to speak about the disaster's responsibility and seeking the criminal responsibility of TEPCO through legal means. The TEPCO criminal trial for the consequences of the responsibility of the accident. In 2019, the criminal trial to hold TEPCO's former management responsible had a not guilty verdict in the Tokyo District Court. However, the lawyers have appealed, and the appeal was held at the Tokyo High Court in November last year. In regards to this, the council argued that the court had erred in its first verdict in several different ways. The first being that the biggest and fundamental error in the original decision was that it denied the reliability and specificity of the long-term assessment. Second, that the legal regulations and national examination standards for reactor safety reflect generally accepted social norms, and therefore, liability for negligence does not arise as long as these are followed. The third, that the obligation to avoid consequences is regarded only as the measures to shut down the nuclear power plant. And four, the court rejected an on-site inspection of the Fukushima Daiichi plant. It further argued that it was clear from the evidence that the accused, that is the TEPCO management, were aware of the possibility of a tsunami exceeding the 10-meter plate, and the countermeasure works should have been carried out based on the tsunami risk assessment. The long-term assessment was the only and reliable view from the national government, apparently. It then, on top of that, called for an examination of the 3 expert witnesses and an on-site inspection of the plant by the judges. On October 29 last year, the judges of the Tokyo District Court hearing of the shareholder lawsuit made a detailed on-site inspection of the Fukushima Daiichi plant. I believe that at the moment, seeing the severity, or even a visit on site, shows the severity of the nuclear disaster, the traces of the tsunami, the location of the reactors, and the distance from the sea. And so a detailed inspection should have provided a detailed verification, which the judges would have felt. I had been eagerly hoping that the judges in the criminal case would also conduct such a site. But at the second appeal hearing on February 9, the site inspections and witness examinations were rejected for the reason that they said that they are unnecessary. The lawyers' objections were also dismissed. However, some of the evidence, including the Tokyo High Court decision in the Chiba damages lawsuit, was accepted. And in the third concluding hearing, they said that they will accept the victims' statements of impact as well. We must once again appeal to society to show how wrong the district court's decision was and how extraordinary it is to make a decision without any actual on-site inspection. And I believe that based on this, we should continue to hope that the judiciary can indeed be a completely independent bastion of justice. I continue to hope for this. And the last point I would like to speak about is the fact that nuclear power plants utilize the same technology as nuclear weapons. As was mentioned in the introduction today as well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the control of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant has raised many people's fears of the tremendous consequences if the plant were to be caught in the crossfire of war. Many people, I think, are extremely worried about this kind of risk. And actually, they're looking at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant being under the shelling there as well. We hope that, of course, the shelling will be stopped as soon as possible. There was a recent NHK satellite television program, and watching that, I was reminded about the fact that nuclear power plants are a method of power generation that uses the same technology as nuclear weapons, the atomic bomb, which kills all living beings. I had thought that the purpose of the atomic bomb was its overwhelming destructive power, and that the exposure to radiation was perhaps a secondary result or aspect of that. But I know that even at the time of the 1942 Manhattan Project, there was already this concept of a radioactive weapon. But despite that, when we look about the exposure of radiation, since just after that, there has been underestimating of the impacts, there has been concealing of the impacts. Since then, nuclear tests in various countries around the world, and also different accidents at nuclear facilities and nuclear power plants have continued to create more and more nuclear victims, nuclear survivors all around the world. How did humanity come to think of such things? This planet Earth is the home of all living beings who are here. We must not allow that. Well, of course, human beings are also part of this. We cannot allow this planet Earth to be polluted or destroyed just for the sake of human desires or convenience. The crisis which the planet is facing today is growing larger by the day. And yet, there are still moments when I think how beautiful this world is. I think each and every one of us must now think carefully in our own way what we need to most value today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ms. Muto. It was very, very important to have been able to hear from you.
We would like to now have a moment to remember all of those who have been impacted and who have passed away as the results of the Fukushima disaster and nuclear incidents all around the world. We will have a moment of silence led by Yuiko. So I haven't really given these words before a moment of silence before, but I have something I would like to share. I mentioned that last year, 5 of my close friends passed away. And within these members were, of course, people who I had been working closely since the disaster, including Yayoi Hitomi of Fukushima, of Koriyama, and also Kenichi Hasegawa of Iitate village in Fukushima, the former dairy farmer. And also Kinue Suzuki, who lived very close to me and evacuated to Kyoto. She also passed away last year. Thinking about them and their passing and the reason for this, well, of course, we cannot completely prove the direct impact, but I do believe that it was most likely connected to the disaster. And of course, other than the 3 names I've mentioned now, so many other friends, partners, people impacted by the Fukushima disaster have passed away in the past 10 somewhat years. Within these 11 years since the disaster, many people who have passed away with their dreams unfulfilled, people working or of course, people impacted by nuclear testings, nuclear weapons uses, and the whole nuclear cycle around the world in this time. I hope that they can at least somehow rest in peace, and that our work to eliminate this nuclear threat from the world can somehow be achieved. So I would like to invite you all for a moment of silence now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much once again, Ms. Muto. Now, we would like to move on to the relay talk. 11 years have passed since the nuclear disaster, and I'm sure that everyone has had a variety of thoughts and feelings. In this relay talk, we'll be hearing from people with different experiences, people who have evacuated from Fukushima to outside, people who still live in Fukushima, former nuclear workers, as well as people from overseas. The first speaker is Nakate Seiichi, joining us from Zoom. Mr. Nakate, please. My name is Nakate Seiichi. Good afternoon, everyone. I was living in Fukushima City in Fukushima Prefecture at the time of the nuclear accident with my family. After 2 weeks after the nuclear accident, I stayed in Fukushima, and the other members of the family, 3 of them, went to the western part of Japan. The following year, until June 2012, I stayed in Fukushima. But in July 2012, I moved to Sapporo in Hokkaido, northern part of Japan, together with my family. So even today, I live in Hokkaido, Sapporo. Through this nuclear disaster, nuclear accident, there are many things happened, but one of the most characteristic things was that there were people who were forced to evacuate, people who lived in the zone which was directed to evacuate, but there were also people who were outside of the evacuation zone because the zone was set quite narrowly. So it gave birth to a lot of so-called voluntary evacuees, including myself. So I was not living in the area that was designated as an evacuation zone. And many of us voluntary evacuees had to experience family members being separated from our own children or wife, partner. I know a lot of families whose some members has to leave, but most of the time, people who had earnings stayed in Fukushima. A lot of times it was called mother and children leaving Fukushima and the father staying in Fukushima. But it was, it entailed a lot of hardship, of course, economically, but also in terms of family tie, it meant a lot of pain and suffering and sorrow. And that was not it. If we talk about voluntary evacuation, so it meant, leaving homeland behind and moving to a completely new place. And yes, it was our decision, it was our will, but there was a division in the community too, between those who stayed and those who left the town. And these are all because of the nuclear disaster, because of the safety myth around nuclear power plants, because we had believed in the safety myth of nuclear power plants. And this is also because, the government had not prepared ourselves for this kind of disaster, and the right of evacuation has not fully supported. So the human rights of the evacuees have been really undermined, and it has continued up to the present day. And right now, there are some people who are using housing for government workers as temporary housing. But what's happening to them right now is, as Ms. Muto said, the government is asking these people to pay double the actual rent. And in case they cannot pay the rent, they're even asking the relatives to take responsibility for these evacuees. That's unbearable. And it's really getting away with evacuees. And this is a violation of human rights and human dignity. So I want to really stop this kind of shameful situation that is happening right now. So I have relocated to Hokkaido, and I'm determined to live permanently Hokkaido. But in Hokkaido too, we have the problem of nuclear waste disposal issue. There is a plan to now use part of Hokkaido as a site for the final disposal of nuclear waste. So I've moved from nuclear power plant, but in this new place that I now live in, we still have issues related to nuclear radioactive contamination, nuclear waste. So I think the only solution is really to get away with nuclear power plants altogether. That's the only way I can finally feel at peace. But what we have now is a restart of nuclear power plants. So we are, in a way, waiting for the second Fukushima. When the nuclear disaster happened in Fukushima, I said to myself that I really don't want the next generation, my children's generation, to experience the same thing. I was very, very regretful for what had happened. We felt that it was our responsibility to put an end to this nuclear age. Stop all the nuclear power plants and create a nuclear-free future. So that's a short message from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Nakate. Next, we will hear from Ms. Olga Ayako. She's also joining us via Zoom today. Over to you. Hello, everybody. In the year 2011, I was running a small farm in the town of Okuma, where the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant is located, and also participating in different activities such as the Fukushima Network for a Nuclear Power-Free Japan. And I also had hope in a new initiative that we were involved in called Decommission Action, 40 years of the Fukushima nuclear power plant and our future. The call was to start thinking about the local community in this decommissioning era, as the nuclear power plant had already been operating for more than 40 years, and local residents were becoming increasingly concerned about the aging of the plant, concealing of data, and the continuous occurrence of problems. However, on March 11, 2011, the severe accident at the nuclear power plant began, followed by the meltdowns and daily explosions. We began to scramble from amidst the emergency evacuation process to demand measures to expand the evacuation zone, radiation protection, and also assistance for evacuation. We had unfortunately failed to stop this nuclear disaster, which we had been fearing for so many years, a tragedy that would affect Eastern Japan and all of, well, the whole world, and with grief mourning our homeland. The radiation contamination spread over a wide area of Eastern Japan. When I served as a contact person for the Mother and Child Support Network for Breastfeeding Research and the Fukushima Nuclear Power Plant Complainants Group, I heard the desperate voices and cries of many people throughout Eastern Japan impacted by the disaster. The population of the intensive contamination survey area designated by the Japanese government, just this area was 7 million people. For 3 years, I was evacuated to that area and trying to somehow live with as little radiation exposure as possible, but it was very, very difficult. First of all, the radioactive plumes fly in and fall. They adhere to road surfaces, rice fields, roofs, and walls of buildings, people, animals outside, plants and crops, and everything else. And together with the dust, they refloat, settle, and move with other substances, both inside the body, indoors, in the outdoor environment, and distant places, dissolving in the water, settling, and continuing to concentrate in puddles, sewage, or rivers. The government has imposed unreasonable disparities in radiation measurements, decontamination, health checkups, and child recuperation programs, as well as housing support, medical fee examinations, and more, creating gaps and divisions between people inside and outside the evacuation zones, inside and outside the Fukushima Prefecture, and many divisions within communities. I myself was also tormented by this really heartbreaking pain and divisions. I believe that the strong measures within the evacuation zones may have been a way to put residents off from speaking collectively or from resisting the storage of radioactive waste. As 5 or 10 years have passed, the Japanese government continues to reduce or terminate their support measures with little regard for the opinions of the actual affected people, their supporters, or other citizens as well. We have crossed over lines and connected together as victims and as citizens to broadly call for relief for victims and to take action, including in the prefectures surrounding Fukushima, such as Miyagi, Ibaraki, and Tochigi. Let's continue to keep our interest monitoring and countermeasures for as long as the lifetime of radioactive materials. One other thing I would like to call to you all is a review of the information on the number of people affected or evacuees in particular. According to the Fukushima Prefecture and national figures, the total number of evacuees, these are often reported by the private sector and so on, they said at around 40,000 people. But in 2021, in January, the Kyoto News replaced the Fukushima's prefecture with a total of 64,000 for each municipality. So Fukushima Prefecture has been left out of the tally without permission due to the type of housing in the evacuation centers. And there are many other different flaws in the system and the operation of evacuee registration and in the tally. Now, in 2022, we believe that the number of evacuees is today estimated to be between 60 and 70,000 people. As people who are living here in Japan as adults, we cannot give up in the future on making the government implement measures to ensure that no one is left behind, whether living in the affected areas or in evacuation centers, and that they can live without fear in regards to their housing or their health. We'll continue to pass our experiences on across borders and across generations and work together to ensure that such a nuclear catastrophe is not repeated again anywhere in the world. Let us all work together. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Oga. And next we will hear from Ms. Uno Saeko. She is also joining us in Zoom today. Hello, everybody. 11 years ago, on March 11, 2011, I evacuated together with my children from Fukushima. I moved from place to place, and now I am living in Kyoto. And thanks to the support of many people, finally able to be here today. I am also involved in the National Network of Evacuees seeking support and also different lawsuits calling for compensation, and also involved in the supporting group for the criminal lawsuit seeking the responsibility of TEPCO. As we are approaching 11 years since the disaster, last year, the 10th anniversary was also, as Ruiko mentioned, a year that many of our close friends passed away, who we worked together for the years. Suzuki Kinue, who was also evacuated from Fukushima to Kyoto, was someone who had been working as the board member in charge of looking after people with disabilities in Fukushima. She herself was also living with a disability since birth, and she was a wheelchair user. She suffered from thyroid cancer, and while struggling against the illness, she worked together thinking about people with disabilities in Fukushima and also teaching people all around Japan the lessons of the evacuation process and of the disaster And she was someone who provided such inspiration and encouragement for all of us. In her last year, we also stayed next to her in her last days as well. And today I would like to share with you part of one of her poems, a poem by the late Kinoue Suzuki. I Have a Dream by Kinoue Suzuki. I have a dream. In the middle of the table, put a flower of love. With the national and prefectural officials, I have a dream to sit together and discuss the future of Fukushima and the future of Japan. I have a dream. The people who work on decommissioning are the most respected, and they have adequate remuneration and rest, and that health and life are protected based on human rights. I have a dream. Despite the evil of endless radiation, we will survive. We will survive. Never underestimate, carefully secure our place in life. With well-selected food and space, we will triumph. I have a dream. The children who protected Fukushima and the children of hope who evacuated will sow the seeds and create a new Fukushima in the future. When future children harvest in happiness, share, and learn to be content, even if it is 100 or 200 years in the future, I will be there on the wind. I have a dream. In March last year, Kinoue returned to heaven, surrounded by her family, friends, and loved ones. I remember the last words I heard from her that made me think, what a wonderful world this is. That was the words that she said. What a wonderful world, and I'm going ahead of you, okay? These were her final words of farewell to me. I will do what I can to take on the legacy of her dream. Since last year, I have started several small initiatives. One is, together with other anti-nuclear colleagues, to look deeply at what is happening today and to continue to provide ongoing spaces and to take more records and to share this with more broader people, to work together with more stakeholders involved in the contaminated water issue, to have more dialogue, to see how we can look at the overall system and find ways to make change. Here, looking at the bureaucrats in the national government, the people within the nuclear village, we also want them part of this dialogue. These are all small steps, but looking at how we can overcome the divisions and to achieve change in society together. This is where I find my hope. These new steps, new initiatives, if anybody is interested, I would be so happy to hear that, and I hope that we can be connected and work together. A society where people can be respected with dignity, where they can value other people, and how we can have the decommissioning process, the permanent storage of radioactive materials done with this human dignity and value in sight as well. We will find a way to do this and continue to move forward together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Saiko. Next is going to be Katsumi Hasegawa. He is joining us from Zoom. Floor is yours, Katsumi. My name is Katsumi Hasegawa, and I evacuated from Koriyama City in Fukushima to Fujinomiya City in Shizuoka on August 11, 2011, 5 months after the Fukushima nuclear accident. I'm actually quite ashamed to say that at the time, I had left in complete ignorance of nuclear issues and vaguely trusted the government. So when I heard that the plant had exploded and the situation was quite dangerous, I assumed that the government would eventually come to the rescue and give some instructions. However, what the government did was to just repeatedly say, please act calmly, there are no immediate health effects. And there were no further actions. So if we put what they said differently, what they were saying was that there could be some effects later. I felt that it was such a frightening thing to say. After thinking over really quite a lot, I left Koriyama City exactly 5 months after the disaster, together with my wife, who was pregnant at the time, and also with my 5-year-old son. I was frustrated. Why the government and no one else took responsibility? Why do we have to decide everything on our own and live like this, as if we are doing a split? In Koriyama, my wife's parents lived 100 meters away from our place. On the day of the evacuation, we decided to stop by one last time to say bye. After we said, what we needed to say, and when we were about to start the car, my son, who was normally really a quiet 5-year-old, and he was totally calm until that moment, suddenly sensed something and said, "Grandma, bye, goodbye, Grandpa, bye, bye-bye." He almost went into a state of panic, screaming over and over again. I too lost the calmness I had been pretending to have, and I really couldn't help thinking, how could this have happened? I'm so frustrated. And I promised myself, I will never let this end like this. I will fight this injustice. I thought I just couldn't let go of the fact that nobody was taking responsibility for what had happened to Fukushima, not just to my boy, but to everyone who was living an ordinary, humble life in the countryside. Of course, as an adult, I am and I was responsible. And I am to be accused of numerous things, including being ignorant and not having done anything about it. However, at the time, after the accident, the then Prime Minister Noda said something like all Japanese are responsible mentality is important, which I thought was not true. Children are not responsible for this at all. Again, I'm aware that I'm very much responsible for what has happened, but I was also feeling like, well, you politicians are even more responsible. Those who have promoted nuclear policy should be hundreds or thousands of times more responsible. And use a phrase like all the Japanese are responsible and pretend that it's all actually so. It's unfair and wrong. That's what I thought. So I became the one to evacuate from the nuclear accident. And I've since participated in various civil society activities. What motivates me in all these is a feeling that I should do something about what has happened as an adult and as someone who was directly affected by the accident. The Fukushima nuclear accident is a social issue that we must never forget. However, if we look around, there are probably many people who are also suffering from bullying, from poverty, from discrimination, and often their suffering is not properly cared for. We are victims of the nuclear accident, but we are not always just victims, the vulnerable ones. I think we can sometimes use our experience of having gone through the disaster to support others. Amidst the COVID-19 disaster, I'm feeling more than ever the importance of being an honest and compassionate human being. I'm also feeling a dire need for politics that's truly sincere and considerate of people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hasegawa, for your words. Next, we will be hearing from Ms. Oda Chiyo. She is also joining us via Zoom today. Hello, everybody. I am from a town in the coastal area of Fukushima, Iwaki City, and this is where I'm joining from today, and I'll be speaking about the issue of releasing contaminated water into the ocean. The area of Fukushima is where the different currents in the Pacific Ocean come together, and this is where there is a huge bounty in the maritime resources. Everybody loves seafood here, delicious food, and this was a place where we were so pleased and proud to be able to live in such an area prior to the disaster. However, March 2011, when the nuclear disaster happened, our life completely changed. The fishing there has been different restrictions, of course, the different not able to be shipping the catch which is being found there. And it was just in April last year when finally started to be able to have these marine catches again. But then in April last year, the Japanese government decided unilaterally that they would be releasing contaminated water into the ocean. This completely went against the promises that this would not be done without the local approval, and amongst huge public opposition from different fishing associations, public comments and consultations and so on. This is completely, well, as citizens, we felt this was unacceptable, but thinking about what can we do about this? Since just after the disaster, of course, there had been so many efforts led by citizens, whether about evacuation, radioactive monitoring, evacuation process, looking at how to support people's lives and livelihoods. And this really felt that this decision was just trampling upon all of our efforts over this decade of years. We started as citizens groups calling for no more contamination of the ocean. We invited scientific experts, technicians, fisher people, general citizens to have their voices heard and shared. However, the water which is going to be released, thinking about what is actually included in this, what levels of radiation are in there, what volume will be released, what impact will that have? None of this is clear yet. But the government and TEPCO are just preparing to release this water, even though nothing is known. They're saying they've even put forward this plan that they will be building an underwater tunnel in order to release it from 1.5 kilometers away. As we are now approaching 11 years since the disaster, detailed information about the impact of the disaster is, I also feel it's becoming more hidden or less and less. The tritium, which will be released into the ocean, they are publishing books and giving textbooks into schools throughout all of Japan, saying that it is safe. And there are these policies which are just going against or on top of what citizens are hoping for. We have set different dialogue sessions with the METI, the ministry responsible, and appealed that this radioactive water should not be released into the ocean. But they ask us, or they've given us instructions not to use the word contaminated water because it will give the wrong impression, just to say treated water. Now, after the Fukushima disaster, I truly believe that nuclear power plants would not be used anymore in Japan or around the world. This was a strong wish, but also something as the responsibility of an adult person who experienced the disaster. I felt certain that we had to make all efforts to make sure that this would not be repeated. But policies going in the completely opposite direction from this are being pursued. The government and TEPCO and people's also mistrust of them is also deeply making us suffer. On top of that, looking at the ocean, it looks the same calm, beautiful ocean next to our lives, but wishing and hoping that people, children, everybody can live in health and safety. This is the same wish of people all around the world as well. When I was thinking about what to talk about today and writing my speech, this was when we saw the Russian military's attack on the nuclear power plant in Ukraine. People being lost, people having to flee from their homelands, children crying. This all reminded us of the confusion and the chaos after the Fukushima disaster. It gave me flashbacks to what had happened then. We are here on this planet together and looking at these nuclear impacts, worried about the effects of radiation. How do we approach this issue together? What can we do? What we can do now is to look at how we can protect our everyday lives and to ensure that no more radioactive contamination can be spread any further. To share this wish and to work together to raise our voices all around the world together. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Ms. Oda, for your words. Next, we will have a message from someone who is known by the pseudonym of Gobo, who is a former nuclear power plant worker. This will be shared via video.
ごぼうと言います。よろしくお願いします。今日はありがとうございます。私は2012年から福島第一原発で原発の爆発事故の後片付けに携わる仕事をやってました。年は40代です。簡単に言うと原発作業と言いますが、私は2012年から10ヶ月間、すいませんね、10ヶ月間働いてたんですが、そこで約20ミリシーベルト記録上は浴びました。その中で感じていたことは、復興したいという政府の考え方と、私たちの仕事内容、装備ですね。装備というと、全面マスクとか、タイベック、白いようなつなぎのようなもの、そういうものがどんどん簡素化されていきました。それは国が被災者を避難しているところから元に戻したいというような思惑が絡んでいると思ってました。あと実際そういうことも仲間内では言われました。自分たちが戻るところに被災者の目線から見たら、すごい大層な格好した人たちがいたら、それは戻る気になれないということで。そこから約10年、今22年経って、内容的には実はほとんど変わってないんじゃないかなというのはすごい感じることがあります。装備とかはすごいマスクとかコンビニあったりとかなんですが、やっぱり元の働き方ですね。私の時は日給1万円で働いてたんですけど、それも下請けなので、契約が終わったら働けなくなるっていうような状態でした。で、危険手当はもらってなかったです。会社としてはもらってたと思うんですが、そういうことが多々あったんですが、悲しいことに10年経っても似たようなことはまだ行われていると思います。うまく隠匿されるような、例えば労災になるような事故というのが言葉とか東電発表の言葉とかでうまい具合にないようにされたりとか、実際の件数が分からなかったりとかしてる。数値も本当に被爆浴びたものと数字で出るものに違いやリスクの大きさ、そういうものが全然違うのは今まで通りだと思います。今は自分は原発で働いてないんですが、荒株さんという方が九州の方から原発爆発して、それで何とかしなきゃっていうことで、福島第一原発の作業に行った人がいるんですが、その人が数値上は20ミリシーベルトくらいですね、通算浴びてて、これは避難者の20ミリシーベルト、期間の目安とほぼ同じだと思うんですが、とりあえずその方が白血病の労災認定を受けました。で、今は東電や他の電力会社などを相手取って、国に対して労災ではお金はもらえるんですが、ちゃんと罪を東電に認めさせて保証させるということが大事になってまして、そこをいろんな、その荒株さん個人的な考えとかもいろいろあると思うんですが、とりあえず今はその活動になってます。で、裁判は今も続いている状態です。その中の一つで、白血病になったのは、例えばタバコを吸ってたからだ、酒を飲んでたからだとか言われることが、いつものことですがあります。それを私たちの方が、荒株さんがですね、説明しなければいけない。それを証明しなければいけない。原発のせいでなったっていうのを。それは実質もうほとんど個人やすごい学者とかが集まっても、すごい難しい状態ではあります。そのこと自体がおかしいとは思ってます。被爆してリスクが増えて病気の。そこから例えばがんや白血病になった時に、個人や素人、また弁護士も集まって証明するっていうのはほぼ不可能に近い、すごい難しいきつい戦いっていうのが正直です。だから、それは被災者の方たちも一緒だと思います。こっちが説明しなければいけない。病気になった時に。そうじゃなくて、逆に言えば向こうっていうのは相手側も、例えばがんになったら喫煙のせいだとかいうのは証明できないというものだと思います。で、そこら辺で、原発の作業者の裁判の内容が被災者や他の方たちと被ることが できてきてると思います。内容として。で、ここはつながれるとこっていうか、逆に今までつながれてなかったり、あまり大きな形でですね。とか、あとはもしくはどっちかがうまくいけば、それは相互作用して、どんどん、その高い壁を越えられたり、壁を崩したりするっていうことができる。そしてすごい大事なことだっていうのを私たち、その荒株さんの裁判を手伝っている弁護士や被爆労働を考えるネットワークというグループの人たちや、あとそういうところを手伝ってくれている人たちやサポーターの人たちで多分考えが移行してきてると思います。それは被爆労働者のためだけじゃなくていろんな人たちのため。荒株さんの裁判はまだまだ続きますので、興味ある方は被爆労働を考えるネットワークという検索してもらえればホームページが見つかりますので、よろしくお願いいたします。以上です。ありがとうございました。
Thank you for this message, Mr. Gobo. Next, we will be hearing from a mother living in Fukushima Prefecture. FOE Japan, since soon after the disaster, has been conducting a different recuperation or support program for families living in the affected areas called Poka Poka Project. And so this is a message from one of the mothers participating in this.
福島県の郡山市に小学4年生と3年生と2歳の子供、全員男の子と住んでいる母です。震災当時は妊娠中で、原発事故があった時は1週間ほど避難はしていたんですが、仕事があったので、その後は郡山市でずっと過ごしてきました。お腹の中にいる子に何か影響あったらと心配はあったんですが、仕事を辞めることもできなかったし、放射能の影響がどのくらいあるのかがわからなかったので、報道では直ちに影響がないということだったので、家族と離れて過ごすということは選択できませんでした。子供が生まれてからは、放射能の影響を考えて、狭いアパートで毎日こもって過ごしていたんですけども、長男、次男、年子で好奇心と行動力がすごく強かったので、初めての子育てだっていうこともあったので、ノイローゼ気味にもなっていました。外で遊ばせたいのに、子供たちはマスクもできない。でも、土を触ったり、それを口へ運んでしまうので、外には出したくないけど、体力が有り余ってしまっていて、子供は小さいので、自分だけで子供を遠くに放射能の影響のないところに連れて行くのは大変だったので、なかなか行けませんでした。そんな時に、ポカポカプロジェクトの保養を見つけることができて、参加するようになりました。初めて参加した時は緊張もありましたが、居場所を見つけたという気持ちの方が大きくて、すごくほっとしたことを覚えています。ポカポカハウスは、郡山市の自宅からそこまで遠くなくて、線量が低かったので、自分で車でも行けるので、とても参加しやすかったです。一緒に参加する家族の方たちとみんな協力し合って、子どもたちを見守ったり、安心できる食材でご飯を作り、悩みや不安を吐き出せるポカポカは、すごく心の支えになっていました。子どもたちもポカポカの中で他の家族と過ごすことや思いっきり遊ぶこと、私がすごく穏やかに過ごしていることなど、たくさん子どもたちも成長させてもらいましたし、私も安心感をもらってきたと思います。子どもたちは小学生になりましたが、まだまだやんちゃ盛りで、このコロナ禍でまたアパートにこもらないといけない日が 増えてきて、震災当時のずっと家にいるあの時の気持ちを思い出すようになりました。今でもやっぱり体力が有り余っているんですが、なかなか、人がいるところに遊びに行けないし、外に出すのもすごく進めるっていうわけでもないので、どうしてもゲームばかりになってしまう日が続いています。もうゲームばかりさせてしまうのも心苦しいんですけども、どうしようもできないっていう感じで過ごしています。震災当時のように思い切り何も気にせず遊べる場所が欲しいなと今も思っています。原発事故から11年が経ったんですが、たくさんあった保養団体も10年を目安にしていた団体が多かったり、コロナの影響もあり、今はもうほぼ保養がありません。今、空間線量は、郡山は除染してあるところはだいぶ下がってきてはいるんですけども、田んぼのあぜ道とか、子供が遊びに行きたがるところは、今でも驚く数値が出たりしています。まだまだ不安もたくさんあるので、子供が大人になるまでは保養に継続して出ていきたいと思っています。
Thank you very much. Next, we will be moving to Wales to have a message from Linda Rogers from People Against Wilfer B in Wales, which is where there was a company from Japan planning to build a nuclear power plant there. She has been long involved in the local grassroots movement against this and looking at stopping this plant being exported by Hitachi. Also being involved, both working against the companies and also the government who had these plans. Here is Linda's message.
Hello, my name is Linda Rogers and I bring greetings from North Wales and PAWB, Pobl Atal Wilferby, People Against Wilferby, the nuclear power station. We are very grateful and honoured to have this opportunity to contribute to this important symposium. It follows on a visit that we made to Japan in 2018 by kind invitation of Friends of the Earth Japan, when together we delivered the petition to the Japanese government protesting the exporting of Japanese nuclear technology to Innismore, Anglesey, in North Wales. What struck the three of us, Bob Idris, Melir Thomas and myself, during our visit, was the similarities between home and the now devastated area of Fukushima. Two beautiful areas, Fukushima and Innismore, were both seen to be ripe for occupation by nuclear companies. Why? Both were seen to be poor areas, lacking in alternative job prospects, rural and underdeveloped. In other words, vulnerable to pressure. Fukushima became governed by TEPCO, the people taught to be dependent on the company. In the same way, the people of Innismore, the schools, county council, local communities, came to be dominated by Wilver nuclear power station. Then, bang, the myth of an all-giving industry turned into its opposite. It became the source of destruction, death, and contamination. Visiting Fukushima after the triple meltdown of the Daiichi nuclear plants, we were completely shocked by the scenes of desolation that met us. It was like visiting a war zone. Areas abandoned, cut off, guarded by masked police. no-go areas too contaminated for human habitation. And the endless rows and walls of black plastic bags containing the contaminated top layers of soil, collected and stacked, as if that was the problem solved, and nowhere to put them. The feeling of a war zone was made more powerful by the culture prevailing that it was un-Japanese to talk about the disaster, that it would not be good for morale. We were shocked by the attempts by authority to gloss over the real events and their impacts. Journalists told us they found it hard to have articles on the disaster published. Mothers, concerned about the health of their children, were labelled paranoid, worried women. Levels of radiation deemed safe in the environment suddenly raised. The extraordinary resilience of the people gathered in support and campaigning groups in the face of such a frightening situation will also stay with us. We remember with pride and honour the welcome such groups gave us as fellow campaigners against nuclear power. We wish to return that support now. We will be commemorating as usual the disaster on the 11th of March with a demonstration. We will write to condemn the dumping of contaminated water into the Pacific Ocean. The ongoing and increasing problem of the waste from the disaster and the health of the surrounding communities should be an international question. It cannot be left in the hands of the IAEA, which exists to promote the interests of nuclear power and not the people or the environment. Let us learn and share the lessons from Fukushima. Let us continue to tell the truth about the disaster that is nuclear power, in small, modular or whatever form. And let us continue to support each other. This symposium will be very important in doing that. Thank you again for this opportunity. Arigato.
Thank you very much, Linda. Next, we will be moving to hear a message from the Pacific Islands. This is a message from MISA for the Pacific.
Konnichiwa. Hello, Yabwe and Bula from Fiji. We are Betty Radule and Wayne Kitchener from the Marshall Islands Student Association, also known as MISA.
Yabwe everyone. Konnichiwa. My name is Wayne Kitchener. I'm from the Marshall Islands, as Betty mentioned, and we are a part of the Marshall Islands Student Association here in Fiji. So to give a bit of a context, the issue of nuclear testing is not, or the issue of nuclear is not something new to the Marshallese people. Between 1946 to 1958, the U.S. conducted 67 nuclear and thermonuclear weapons tests in the Marshall Islands. And on March 1st, 1954, the U.S. detonated Castle Bravo, the largest atomic nuclear test in the Pacific. It was found to be 1,000 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The ramifications of these tests were extensive in terms of geographic reach, environmental impacts, numerous health and socioeconomic issues that have echoed through the generation. So each year, the cancer rates, illness continues to rise in the Marshall Islands.
To say that these nuclear tests are a devastating part of our history is an understatement. While nuclear tests were conducted particularly in Bikini and Enewetak atolls, the fallout traveled to Rongelap Atoll and Guduruk Atoll, 100 miles away, and the people living on these islands were not moved until 3 days later, serving as human guinea pigs for the United States government testing program. Today, 68 years after the Bravo shot, the people of Bikini are still displaced and they long to return to their home islands. The people of Enewetak returned, but their home island is still yet to be rid of the nuclear waste currently being stored in the massive radioactive Runit Dome. The Marshallese people were told that this was for the good of mankind. At the great exploitation, they suffered great loss.
Yeah, and so one of the things the association, the Marshallese Student Association, likes to do is to raise awareness on the issue. Because besides the Marshall Islands, there were other Pacific Islands here in the region that were used as testing grounds for nuclear weapons by the developed countries such as US, UK, and France. On March, recently we did our annual solidarity march here at the university in Suva, Fiji, and hundreds of youth and activists marched in Suva in solidarity for nuclear victims and survivors all over the world. We remember the devastating impacts of nuclear colonialism felt across the Pacific, even in the islands of Mororoa and Whangataufa atolls, Kiribati, Christmas Island, Kiritimati, and Johnson Island, and even in Fiji with the soldiers that were sent to these islands during the testing programs in the early 1950s. This march was a platform to call for a nuclear justice and disarmament, as well as a worldwide attention to the impending nuclear threat, including the development in Ukraine and thousands of Ukrainian citizens that live in fear of high alert due to Russia's nuclear arsenal being put on high alert.
As we near the anniversary of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, we again want to raise our voices in concern for the Pacific Ocean. We know what happens when islands and people are exposed to radiation. We know we've been there and we've been tricked before. We won't be fooled again by the use of scientific jargon such as insignificant and measurable impacts to disguise the true and lasting implications of how the TEPCO wastewater dumping will affect our ocean, ecosystem, health, and way of life.
So yeah, this is a great concern for the Pacific Island people. In line with recommendations submitted to TEPCO by the Pacific Collective on nuclear issue at the end of 2021, which was something that MISA endorsed. Our recommendation is that the Japanese government and TEPCO abandon the use of the Pacific Ocean as dumping ground for the radiation wastewater from the Fukushima plant. Two, there is lack of consultation, so we recommend that an independent expert review to undertake and oversee all these consultation with the Pacific leaders for the dumping. Three, all appropriate alternative measures are to be considered by the Japanese government and TEPCO to prevent, abate, and eliminate to the fullest extent possible the pollution of the Pacific Ocean by radioactive water, including exploring all options for maintaining storage facilities on land for the radioactive wastewater. An urgent comprehensive reassessment of the decommission plan is necessary as the first step, and this should include all alternative options for safe containment, storage, as well as identification of technology that can safely treat radioactive material, including the radioactive wastewater proposed to be discharged into the Pacific Ocean under the current proposal. Four, a better process is needed to design for consultation as called by Pacific leaders and regional institutions between the government of Japan and its closest neighbors, including the Pacific Island governments, and also ensuring citizens' participation. These are some of the very important things that they should consider before dumping this water. The lack of consultation is something that's very important that we need to address. We all share the same ocean, and this is something that MISA has always been saying as well. We are all connected by the ocean, so if this happens, everybody is affected by this.
We also call for public, youth, and CSO organizations to raise their voices in opposition to the dumping of this nuclear waste. The uncertainty is far too risky, and if there are any miscalculations, the effects would be irreversible. In the Marshall Islands, we say "Kange Tubat," which was our theme for this year's Nuclear Independence Day. We want to share that with you. It means to stand strongly rooted as ironwood. And the ironwood is a plant that is very strongly rooted in our coastal shores. And so we use that as an inspiration for us to stand strong, to be vigilant, and to safeguard our islands and people from further harm to our environment, safety, and human rights. Komotada, arigatou gozaimasu, and thank you very much.
Komotada.
Thank you so much for this message from the Pacific. We have the last video message, which is from Jan Varode from Bund, which is Friends of the Earth, Germany.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. It is a great honor for me to contribute to your event and to call to mind this severe and ongoing disaster. I would like to share with you some insights about the German nuclear phase-out and the current situation with the taxonomy here in Germany. My name is Jan Varode, and I work for Friends of the Earth Germany as a campaigner for nuclear energy politics. The Fukushima disaster still plays an important role for the debate about nuclear power here in Germany. As you know, due to the 2011 events and the immense and strong nationwide anti-nuclear protest, Angela Merkel and the government decided to stop their plans of extending the lifetime of nuclear power. It was the beginning of the phase-out of nuclear. This year, 11 years after this decision, in December 2020, Germany closes the last 3 reactors. So after 60 years, nuclear energy in Germany will finally be history. This is a huge step, a huge success for the anti-nuclear movement and all the protesters all over the world, but also in Germany, and a huge success also for us. You can definitely be sure that we will celebrate this. In the past, there was politics and industry who formed a well-connected and really powerful pro-nuclear lobby. They seemed for us unstoppable and dominated nearly everything in politics. Nevertheless, the decision to end nuclear power shows what social movements really can achieve. However, we're not even close to end the nuclear chapter in Germany, and still there's a lot of things to do. Briefly, I should mention that in Germany, we will run the 2nd largest uranium enrichment plant in the world and supply many European but also international power plants with fuel made in Germany. In addition, there's still no repository for the thousands of tons of nuclear waste, and the situation in our intermediate storage facilities is very, very critical. That said, it might seem quite paradox to see on the one hand Germany shut down its nuclear power plants, while on the other hand the European Union is labeling nuclear in their taxonomy as a green energy. Nuclear power is by far not green, nor sustainable, nor profitable. It is the opposite of a green technology. And sadly, what should have been Europe's instrument to prevent this greenwashing became the biggest greenwashing of all time. It became a political issue, a political fight between pro-gas and pro-nuclear countries. We, as Friends of the Earth Germany, strongly opposed this taxonomy with gas and with nuclear, and within only 1 month, over 350,000 people here signed our petition to stop this. We're really happy to hear that also a lot of people in Japan and a lot of NGOs opposed this taxonomy. All in all, the opposing position in Germany against nuclear is quite stable. All the democratic parties, as well as the electricity companies and the industry, is against nuclear. But in the last weeks, we had a huge media coverage about the phase out and a debate about not stopping the nuclear power plants, but in politics, the decision hasn't changed. So also in the general public opinion, over 75% of the population is in favor of phasing out nuclear here in Germany. For us, for Friends of the Earth Germany, the Energiewende is the key to the future energy production, which is based on renewables. Nevertheless, the last couple of years, the government has failed to expand the capacities of wind and solar power and to increase energy efficiency. There's a lot of things to do, and a lot of things need to be done to make this a success. For us, we need a more social and ecological transition without gas and especially without nuclear. Fukushima has shown us once more that nuclear power is not safe, not sustainable, and not a technology for the future. Again, this year on the Fukushima anniversary, a lot of people will protest against nuclear here in Germany and also protest against the EU taxonomy. To call to mind the severe and ongoing disaster still moves a lot of people here and all over the world to stand up for nuclear-free and a renewable future. Thanks again for having me and for having the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you very much. And this brings us to the end of the relay talk. Thank you so much for everybody who shared their messages. We know that the 5 minutes was a very restricted time. So you, I'm sure, had much more to say, but thinking about what has been lost, what has been gained, what has been experienced in these past 10 years, I think this was a really important opportunity for us to reflect upon this, but to also consider our hopes as we work together as well. Thank you to all speakers in these relay talk messages. So now we will have a 10-minute break from now. Here in Japan, it is 3:36 p.m. So we'll be beginning again in 10 minutes. For those of you who are here in the venue, we have a desk selling different books, materials, and also with leaflets and materials and so on. So we invite you to take a look. And those on Zoom, please feel free to take a break and we will restart in 10 minutes. We have some other announcements as well. FOE Japan is also annually releasing a small booklet about the situation of the Fukushima disaster following the disaster and the energy outlook here in Japan as well. We have the 2021 already available, but the 2022 version will be released very shortly. So we invite you to take a look at the FOE Japan homepage. We also have a project called the Fukushima Mieruka project, or Making the Disaster Visible. We have a special website containing various different information about this. In the link, we have just included the link to that homepage, in the chat as well. Also, an invitation to those of you joining, or anybody online. Peaceboat is holding regularly some different online seminars and study sessions and so on. We invite you to take a look at our homepage for further information about this. Peaceboat has also launched an emergency relief fund for Ukraine. Please consider kindly donating to this. You can find a link for this in the chat as well. So now we'll have a break for just under 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much. It is now 10 minutes, so we would like to begin on part 2 of today. So we will be entering part 2 now, and here we'll be looking at what kind of society, what kind of future do we want to create from now, looking also at nuclear issues and connected to the climate crisis. We have 4 speakers who will be joining us for this panel. 2 of them are here physically in person here in Tokyo, and 2 will be joining us online from overseas. We'll hear first of all about 10 minutes from each of the speakers. And then after that, we will be having a panel discussion, which will also be time to respond to the different questions which are coming in through the Q&A. First of all, we will be hearing from Akira Kawasaki, who is an executive committee member of Peaceboat, and also an international steering group member of ICAN, the 2017 Nobel Peace Laureate, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So, Mr. Akira Kawasaki, over to you to begin. I'm wondering which direction to look. Can I find the camera? Yes. Yes. Sure. It's difficult in a hybrid event to know sometimes. approaching 11 years since the Fukushima disaster. This is a serious situation happening in many places all around the world, as we have been reminded of in the first part of today, looking, of course, at the military attacks on Ukraine by the Russian military, something which was very hard for us to even, of course, predict to happen, but also looking at the attacks happening around the nuclear power plants in Ukraine, a place of huge concern. At the same time, we are seeing that there are either statements from President Putin threatening the actual use of nuclear weapons as well. This really shows us that we are facing this very real threat of nuclear use. It may be hard to have a real sense of this, but this, I believe, is truly a real danger that we are facing. Within my activities as Peace Boat, I have had the opportunity to work with a lot of people from Ukraine. Very recently, a journalist in Ukraine said that they want to convey what's happened in Fukushima to people in Ukraine. So we've been working to translate several literature works into the Ukrainian language. We've been working together since the end of last year towards this, and working with some people in Fukushima to share different information. And we're looking toward having these translations published by April 26th, the anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. We were in touch in January about this, very practical issues. And then when I contacted her the day after the invasion began, she said at first, well, you know, we're hanging on, we're fine. But after this, there were several days where email did not reach her at all. Also within our NGO network, of course, as Peace Boat, the different information that we're hearing from people locally there as well, looking at these threats of nuclear use by President Putin. And since this time, we are also receiving a lot of really concerned messages from people asking, what do we do if there is a nuclear disaster? What happens? How do we run away if a nuclear weapon is used? Is there materials from Hiroshima and Nagasaki that you can seek out and share with us? What happened after Fukushima? How do people protect themselves? But of course, it's not the kind of situation where we can just tell people, well, this is how you can escape from a nuclear weapon. It's not easy to respond to this, but we've shared different materials in English from this. And this is still, of course, continuing today. These actions of Russia, of course, we could, debate these in many different ways, but looking at the very fundamental issues, the international order, represented by the United Nations and the multilateral bodies that we have, this is really putting these at risk. It's threatening this. Of course, the military invasion against a sovereign state, the use and threat of use of force against a sovereign state is something which is a basic principle of the United Nations Charter. So this is a clear violation of this. Also, the threat of use of nuclear weapons is something which, well, of course, it's against the UN Charter, but also various other international conventions and treaties, and also the International Court of Justice opinions until now as well. And the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW, is also a part of this international law. This was adopted by 122 countries' approval in 2017, and it entered into force last year. And there are more than 50 countries now who have ratified this. This is increasing, and we're preparing at the moment for the first meeting of states parties to this nuclear ban treaty to take place in the middle of this year. The TPNW continues on from previous conventions which have prohibited the use of biological or chemical weapons, and also other, well, so-called inhumanitarian weapons, weapons of mass destruction. So this is part of the international law and its norms, but this is the first treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons as part of this tradition, these international norms. Nuclear weapons, of course, well, what is different between the TPNW and previous nuclear disarmament-related treaties, non-proliferation treaties? Well, what is often compared, of course, is the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so this prohibits the development of nuclear weapons by new countries, but allows the peaceful use of nuclear and nuclear energy. And this is looking at, well, nuclear power plants can be run under certain conditions, but this is prohibited from developing into nuclear weapons. And so it is about, prohibiting new countries and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The difference between this and the TPNW is that the TPNW also is for not allowing any use of nuclear weapons, of course, but not only that, but in addition to that, as a particular characteristic, prohibiting the use, the threat of use, and also any deployment of nuclear weapons from another country into one's own country, or also any support or assistance for the use of nuclear weapons. So it's very comprehensive in what it does indeed prohibit, all of these activities. And so we are seeing the debate now in Japan about the TPNW. Well, the Japanese government is refusing to join this treaty. But the Hibakusha, the Eibon survivors organizations and Metis citizens are calling on the Japanese government to join the treaty. But even if it takes time to join, to at least attend as an observer the meeting of states parties happening in this year. So this is looking at an issue, of course, of Japan's security policies. Currently, the Japanese government does not have its own nuclear weapons. However, it is in some way, approving or supporting the US nuclear weapons potential usage by being under the US nuclear umbrella in this way. And this structure is a very dangerous thing. This is what is really being demonstrated by the crisis in Ukraine at the moment. And we have seen that the debate in Japan in the past couple of days is now going in a very dangerous direction, even proposing nuclear sharing. Nuclear sharing basically means Japan sharing the nuclear weapons of the United States. So that means potential deployment of US nuclear weapons within Japan as well. This is a clear shifting to the side of potentially using nuclear weapons and saying that Japan should join and take part in this side. This is a completely absurd. First of all, it is against the 3 non-nuclear principles of Japanese policy. This has been part of Japanese policy for decades already. And it is also actually in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The NPT also says that nuclear weapons of a country which is a nuclear weapon state under the NPT cannot provide these or to other countries as well. But this is something which Japanese politicians, even including former prime minister or the leader of political party, are actually outright proposing this. The fact that we have come to this point of the debate in Japan is a very dangerous thing. And in the background of this is, of course, seeing as this war in Ukraine is continuing, of course, people are getting worried. That is natural, I believe. People are worried about their own lives, about national security of Japan. I completely believe that it's understandable to be worried about this. But if we see, well, if Russia is threatening for nuclear weapons, then let's also make our own threat. Participating in this escalation of threats is not the way to deal with these concerns. It is the way, what we need to do is strengthen international law, strengthen the international order, to join the nuclear ban treaty, to look at how to form nuclear weapon-free zones, how to create this kind of alternative security, which is not relying on nuclear weapons. This is what should be the direction that the world, including the United Nations after World War II, has heading toward. But if we don't do that, then this is indeed not an exaggeration, but really looking at the war of Russia upon Ukraine could also become a total war between Russia and NATO if there is a potential use of nuclear weapons that would, of course, have the risk of really leading to World War II. So as people in Japan who know the true impact of nuclear weapons, who know what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, need to send this message to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was such a short 10 minutes, but thank you so much for your brief report. Continuing on, I would now like to invite Dave Sweeney from Australia. For 30 years, Dave has been working on issues related to mining resources and nuclear energy through his work in the media, trade unions, and environmental organizations. He has led the Australian Conservation Foundation's Nuclear Free campaign and also is a co-founder of ICAN, International Campaign of abolish nuclear weapons. And recently, there has been a growing call for nuclear power as a means to combat climate change. But Dave is also involved in the international campaign that says that nuclear power should not be used to combat climate change. You also talk about the issue of uranium mining, which is related to both nuclear weapons and nuclear power. I just want to draw your attention to the interpretation function. Please press the globe icon and choose the language you wish to listen to. So Dave, please.
Konnichiwa. Thank you, Ayumi. And thank you very much to FO Japan and to Peace Boat. It's a great honour to be able to represent the Australian nuclear free movement at this forum today. It's a very important forum at a very uncertain time, and it is absolutely pivotal in a week where the world has been frightened, concerned and active over a new nuclear threat in Ukraine, that we remember, that we reflect on, and that we recognise and seek to assist and repair those people's lives who have been affected, that have been dislocated, who have passed in relation to Fukushima. And I honour and acknowledge all those who bear witness and act every day to achieve that repair, that recognition and justice. I want to talk today about building a clean energy future, which is a fundamental aspect and a key challenge that we must do after Fukushima. If we could move on. Please, just quickly, in Australia at the moment, we are looking to continue our work to end uranium mining and rehabilitate and repair former mines. That's a very important issue to us because we have around 35%, 1/3 of the world's uranium. We supplied the uranium that TEPCO had in the Fukushima Daiichi reactor, and this is an issue we want to not contribute to this fuel anymore. We're also opposing a federal government plan to locate Australia's radioactive waste against the wishes of Aboriginal people in regional South Australia. We're promoting responsible renewable energy that's sustainably sourced, and we are advancing, as Akira-san said, the TPNW, the global nuclear ban. And like Japan, Australia too is a nuclear umbrella nation. We have a particularly important role in advancing this ban. Thank you. So we have some foundation principles that inform our work. One is that radiation is dangerous and exposure to it, human exposure, should be minimised. One is that there is no net benefit from nuclear technology, and there are always clear links between military and civil nuclear technology. A key one for us is that Indigenous lands and peoples are especially impacted by the nuclear industry. And I note what our colleagues and friends from MESA, Pacific Island students, said earlier. And particularly in relation to this discussion today, we believe that nuclear is no solution to climate change. Recently, from the end of October until the middle of November last year, there was COP26 in Glasgow. The world gathered to talk climate and climate responses. Now, we're in a climate emergency. We need to reduce dramatically the amount of carbon going into the climate, into the atmosphere. There was not enough to protect the climate out of Glasgow, but there was enough to continue our work. Some nations showed a real ambition. There was the first explicit reference to coal. Sadly, it got watered down, but it was the first time it was there. There was a measured plan to phase out diesel and petrol cars. There were methane reductions and climate financing and mitigation work financing. Again, like I say, not enough, but a basis for work. Thanks. What we did see though in Glasgow could move to the next slide, what we did see in Glasgow is the nuclear industry making a very sustained and serious push to position itself as a credible response to climate. The nuclear sector argues that it's low or zero carbon, that it's reliable and affordable, that nuclear is compatible with renewable energy, and that the new generation, next generation small modular reactors avoid all the old problems, which is possible because they don't actually exist. But there's no question whatsoever that the nuclear industry is pushing hard. If you look at the next slide, you can see that after COP26, their reflection was that this was a pivotal point in global perception of nuclear energy, and that we, the industry, must press forward with ambitious plans for a rapid expansion of global nuclear power generation. As we heard from Jan from FO Germany, the key industry focus now is on the EU energy taxonomy and also on COP27, which, COVID willing, will be held in Egypt in November. So there is a very concerted push for nuclear energy, and we also know that there is a strong resistance. The next slide shows some of these through a series of groups that have coalesced around the name Don't Nuke the Climate. And Don't Nuke the Climate is a global network of anti-nuclear and environmental organisations. I'd point you to that website, don'tnuketheclimate.org. One of the key things of recent times that we did was a letter that outlines, or a global statement that outlines concerns with nuclear power. And over 470 groups, including over 230 in Asia Pacific region, endorsed this before COP. It's an important document. We say in relation to nuclear that it's no solution to climate change for a number of reasons, and I'll just step through these quickly now, and we have the option to talk more in the panel section about aspects of them. But we say that nuclear is no solution to climate, or not a credible climate response. If we could move to the next slide, please. Because it is too slow, it is too risky, it is too costly or expensive, and the next generation technology is simply unproven. If we look at these now, if we look at the too slow, we can go along. This slide here is just the nuclear fuel cycle, and you can see at every point there's opportunities for proliferation, for weapons production, for fallout, for risk, and for radioactive waste. It's no way a clean industry. The next slide looks at some of the questions about too slow. Nuclear is slow to build, license, and become a net electricity generator. It's wherever it's happening, there are extensive and routine time overruns. And it's highly centralized, slow to deploy. Renewables far faster and more flexible. If we look at the cost, there are massive cost overruns at all the existing facilities and with new build reactors, and particularly Hinkley C in the UK is a classic case in point. Renewables, the suite of renewables, are far cheaper and more popular with both people and, interestingly, with the market. And they're also better aligned with energy access, justice, and sustainability, including the Millennium Sustainability Goals. We also look at nuclear and we say it's too risky. One of the key questions, and a big one we're talking about today, is waste. It's a huge and unresolved global management problem. There is still no proven or agreed solution. And we're seeing that with the discussion about 1.25 million tonnes of contaminated liquid being slated for direct disposal into the Pacific. You get 3 years of electricity from a nuclear fuel rod in a reactor, and that leaves a legacy of 100,000 years of waste. It's a very poor return ratio. So given that massive intergenerational burden, it cannot be considered clean. Thank you. This is a group of Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory who successfully fought a campaign to stop dumping on their lands. They didn't for an instant think that this was clean. We look at nuclear waste, we look at nuclear weapons and the fact that a dual fuel technology and the Ukraine conflict has highlighted so sharply how easily nuclear infrastructure is weaponized. No one is saying, I hope the Russian troops are responsible at the wind farm. No one is saying, I hope the troops are responsible at the solar plant. We are looking at the Zaporizhia and other nuclear plants with fear for the reason that they are a pre-deployed terrorist target. And then, apart from routine emissions, there are occasional, spectacular, tragic and profound disasters. Chernobyl and the one that we'll talk about today, the one that we're marking this week, Fukushima. Thank you. One of the things that I really want to convey though, is that the nuclear industry has pinned all its hopes of a renaissance or a new lease of life on technology which doesn't exist. Small modular reactors do not exist in the commercial world. They do not generate 1 watt of power. They would require several $100 billion of direct and indirect subsidies over several decades. And I think there's a really interesting comment that was made at COP26 by the UN Special Advisor on Climate, who said, where countries are depending on technologies that have not yet been developed, that's reckless and irresponsible. Everything about the nuclear industry, it strikes me as reckless and irresponsible, and so is the false promise of it as a climate solution. This woman here is Yvonne Margarula. She's the senior traditional owner of the Mirarr people in Kakadu. I wanted to put her in today as I close my speech for 2 reasons. One is that the Mirarr people have fought their land to get their land uranium mining free. It now is. They have seen out one mine, they stopped another mine, they're now working closely and we work in partnership to get a good rehabilitation of that country. Many people in Japan have stood strong alongside the Mirarr in this journey. But the Mirarr also feel a great personal connection and burden with the Fukushima story because uranium from their country is believed or understood to have been in the reactor complex at the time of the earthquake, the tsunami, the meltdown. Former Japanese Prime Minister Naito Kan came over to Australia after he left the Prime Ministerial office and he met with the senior traditional owners. It was a very powerful time where they talked about the shared responsibility, and people in this country feel enormously a responsibility because we provided the fuel that made the Fukushima problem or the Fukushima disaster possible. Yvonne was asked, after having lived the lived experience of the longest Aboriginal nation in Australia with the most direct contact with the nuclear industry, she was asked about the experience of that. She's a thoughtful woman. She paused and she spoke and said, none of the promises last, but the problems always do. And I think that's a really important point. And it's also a really important point to remember that so does the resistance, so does the community concern and action, and so increasingly do solutions that are not nuclear or not fossil. I'll leave you today just with this take-home message of don't nuke the climate. This is the logo of the organisation. Do check out don'tnuketheclimate.org, and I look forward to joining you in panel and discussion. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion today, and my solidarity, my sympathy, my profound respect to everyone in Japan and far beyond who are working to highlight and seek redress at Fukushima and to highlight and halt the nuclear industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave, for your presentation now. We'll continue, and our next speaker is Kako Okuno, who is an activist with Fridays for Future Hiroshima and Fridays for Future Japan. So she is involved both in the climate and the anti-nuclear weapons movement here. And she'll be speaking about why she's involved in this movement and what kind of climate justice Fridays here in Japan is calling for, and of course, around the world. Kako Okuno, over to you next. Hello, everybody. As introduced, my name is Kako Okuno, and I am a campaigner calling for climate justice and climate action as part of Fridays for Future, and I'm also involved in different anti-nuclear weapons actions as well. In September 2019, I launched Fridays for Future in Hiroshima. First, we started with online actions and also different policy advocacy calling for climate policy of the Japanese government. The motivation for me to start and involved in Fridays and to launch in Hiroshima was a speech by Greta Thunberg. And one of the things she said there was imagining 70 years from now, imagining being asked by children or grandchildren, why didn't you take action before? This really had a huge impact on me when I heard these words. And I started to think about, if I have children or grandchildren 70 years from now, were we able to stop the climate change, the climate crisis? What would I tell them if they asked me this? For me, also, particularly looking at the impacts of the climate crisis on developing countries was something I put a lot of effort into. When I was a high school student, I had the opportunity to visit the Philippines and seeing at how the different gas being emitted by us in industrially developed countries, and what kind of impacts that is having on people in developing countries. And that made me really become or know that we have to seriously act about climate issues. This is a photograph of when I visited Cebu, and this is when they were hit by a large typhoon in December of that year. Several thousands of people lost their homes as a result of this. And when I was in the Philippines, of course, I met people who really were living day by day on whatever money they could raise on a daily basis to buy food, to find shelter. And so thinking for them, if they lose their homes, lose their shelter, on this day-to-day kind of living, what kind of impact these disasters would have? It's 3 months since this typhoon hit, but I hear that still there are many places without electricity where the infrastructure has not been recovered as well. And thinking about the fact that it is us in these advanced developed countries who are responsible for this and are having this responsibility about how it's impacting people's lives around the world. So within taking action, the time that we have left to make a change is not long. 7 years from now, I'm going to be 27 years old, but it's said that the time that we have left is only 7 years to stop this, in order to make sure that we can make sure that the temperature increase is made under 1.2 degrees. This might sound like, well, it's already increased by 1.2 degrees. Some people might not think that that's very much, but if we think about it as a human body, think about the difference between a temperature of 36.5 to 37.7. What a huge difference that is. So this is really something urgent. And within this, we are hearing voices saying that nuclear energy is something that we can do to stop this, but this is something I find very fearful, and I'm very much against that as well. Thinking about the impacts of the exposure from radiation on the environment, on the workers who are there, even when no disaster happens. But then, of course, what has been experienced here in Japan, as we know from Fukushima, there is also the issue of unresolved nuclear waste issues. If we're looking at how to take action for the climate for future generations, well, nuclear waste, it's the same thing, right? We shouldn't be leaving this for future generations either, I believe. With these issues still not resolved and people trying to still promote nuclear power as a climate measure is something we need to be against, and we need to look at how we can instead shift to renewable energy. In the past 2.5 years since I launched Fridays in Hiroshima, of course, it's not yet enough, but there are certainly some changes that we are seeing. When I first started being active in 2019, Japan we have been campaigning for Japan to change its, I never imagined that Japan would be talking about net zero emissions, and looking at the NDC, looking at the nationally determined contribution was being set at 46% at the time. But seeing this, of course, we haven't seen as much progress as we want to see about this. There are more improvements that we need to see. But the NDC, it did change from 26% to 46% of a reduction that's being called for. And also Japan has said that it will at least aim for net zero as well. It's not enough, but we need to continue to raise our voices as well. The climate change and also nuclear weapons are issues that were created by human beings. And so that is why it is up for us as humans to resolve them as well. I look forward to continuing to raise our voice together with all of you to work on the issues of the climate, of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy as well. And finally, I'd like to introduce that Fridays for Future is planning a global day of action on March 25th. Later this month, we will be having simultaneous actions all around the world, calling for climate justice, for climate action, and I hope that many of you will be able to participate in this as well. The details are on our social media and homepage as well, so I hope that you can take a look and get involved as well. I think that by raising our voices together and taking action, we can really work to tackle and make change in all of these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your powerful message, Kako. Next, last but not least, I would like to invite Ms. Shi-King Chen, a researcher and campaigner with the Green Citizens Action Alliance in Taiwan, to take the podium. In Taiwan, a referendum recently blocked the resumption of construction of the fourth nuclear power plant, effectively moving Taiwan away from nuclear power. So Ms. Chen will talk about the citizens' victory in the nuclear power plant phase out. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Shi-Ting from Taiwan. I work for Green Citizen Action Alliance as a nuclear-free campaigner. Thank you so much for having me today. I would like to express my support and respect for people who have been fighting since the nuclear catastrophe happened in Fukushima 11 years ago. The end of 2021 marked a unique moment in the history of the nuclear-free campaign in Taiwan, since Taiwanese voted against the fourth nuclear power plant and put an end to this fight that has been going on for more than 3 decades. I would like to give you a snapshot of our campaign. Firstly, I will show you the timetable of Taiwan's nuclear phase-out and an overview of Taiwan's electricity generation mix. Then I'll be talking about the fourth nuclear power project in 3 parts. And this presentation will conclude with future goals of our nuclear-free campaign. There were 3 nuclear power plants in operation in Taiwan with a total of 6 units. 3 of them are in the decommissioning process now after running for 40 years. And all 3 remaining units are scheduled to be decommissioned by mid-2025 after an operation span of 40 years as well. There will be no life extension for Taiwan's nuclear power plants. And in the absence of license renewal of the old plants and without new nuclear project, Taiwan will achieve a nuclear phase-out by 2025. As you can see here, number 1, 2, and 4 are all within the 30-kilometer radius from our capital city, Taipei, with over 6 million people living in the area. And nuclear power merely accounted for some 9% of the country's electricity generation in 2021. Even if the fourth nuclear power plant were completed, it would merely contribute some 3 to 4 of the electricity generation. But lots of polls show that around 30% of Taiwanese people thought that nuclear power is the main source of Taiwan's electricity. The fourth nuclear power plant consisted of 2 advanced boiling water reactors. Those third generation nuclear reactors were designed and produced by GE of the United States and Hitachi Group of Japan. The project was proposed in 1980 with its site designated in Gongliao district of New Taipei City. In the aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe, the project was then temporarily put on hold. In 1988, the year I was born, actually, residents of Gongliao organized a community group to fight against the project. However, the KMT-led government resumed the project in 1992. The DPP got elected and declared to have the fourth nuclear installation mothballed in 2000, but was forced to resume the project after a few months because they didn't have enough support in the parliament. From then onward, the project was plagued by delays and cost overruns. It should have been connected to the grid in 2011 and was again delayed. In the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear catastrophe in 2011, Taiwan's anti-nuclear campaign subsequently gained new momentum, facing mass protests and public anger over cost overruns, insoluble technical failures, and mounting evidence of cutting corners on safety requirements. The KMT government was compelled to have the project mothballed in 2014. So the current state of the project is that the license have already expired and the unused fuel rods were shipped back to the states. The first referendum on nuclear power was held in 2018, initiated by the KMT, nuclear engineering scholars, and the nuclear industry in Taiwan. They proposed to abolish the provision outlined in the Electricity Act, which mandated that the operation of all nuclear power plants should come to an end by 2025. And the proposal passed. As a result, the provision did get removed from the Electricity Act, which meant Taiwan was no longer obligated by law to eliminate nuclear power by 2025. But in reality, the existing plants had passed the deadline to apply for life extension, and the fourth plant were still far from being complete. So the pro-nuclear camp initiated a second referendum, and 52.8% of the voters voted against completing the fourth nuclear power plant. So the referendum result signaled the end of the nuclear program. So one of the main arguments we made is that a yes vote in referendum on the resumption of the project is equivalent to a green light to a nuclear disaster. Because as what Dave was saying, it's too risky, too costly, and too slow. With construction accident becoming common occurrence, the fourth nuclear facility was proven to be risk-prone. Furthermore, the design basis of the plan was made to withstand minor earthquakes only. So the new evidence provided by geologists show that with the discovery of 5 new active fault lines, seismic risks will go far beyond the initial design basis. And the construction suffered repeated delays and 5 separate cost overruns from 1990 to 2014. And its building costs had rose up to NT 283.8 billion, and it would take at least another 15 years to complete, which would make the total construction period 30 years, while incurring another 100 billion Taiwan dollars in additional costs. And we also emphasize that the social impacts of nuclear disaster cannot be underestimated. The people of Ukraine and the people of Japan have been bearing the brunt of the effects of nuclear catastrophe. And the importance of nuclear power in the world's energy mix is in downward spiral because there are just a lot, like many other cheaper, faster, safer alternatives. Also, the safe geological disposal of high-level nuclear waste remain a pipe dream throughout the world. So here are some of the action we organized along with many other NGOs in Taiwan last year. We organized a walk against nuclear power. There were 21 anti-nuclear activists taking part in the mock evacuation plan of the 4th nuclear power plant. The number of the participants coming from different background and ages represented 21 districts of the emergency planning zones where the plant is located. It took them 24 straight hours to make a 70 kilometers journey from the power plant all the way to downtown Taipei, a situation that most residents within emergency planning zone would undergo if the nuclear facility were in operation. Due to restriction on public gathering during the pandemic, we collected some 2,000 pairs of shoes donated by anti-nuclear citizens and placed them on the public square in Taipei. It represented the deep concern and strong will of the anti-nuclear movement. Before COP26, GCA and other NGOs in Taiwan, along with more than 400 groups around the globe, made statements saying nuclear energy is no solution to climate breakdown. So we also invited Dave and Ayumi to share their point of view on the press conference. Here are the future goals of our nuclear-free campaign. Pushing for dismantling of the 4th nuclear power plant and the safe decommissioning of other 3 plants. Holding the government responsible for safely managing nuclear wastes. And promoting a just and rapid transition to renewable alternatives. And very important is to participating in global climate action. Thank you so much for sharing, and really means a lot for me to be able to share my experience with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Xiting Chen, for sharing your presentation. So next we have about 40-50 minutes. So we'll have our 4 panelists to come back, and we'll be having some Q&A shared as well. For those people who are here in the venue in Tokyo, we've been handing out pieces of paper that people are writing their questions on. So anyone with a question is sharing those and they will be reflected. And those of you who are joining via Zoom, please add your questions in the Q&A function that you will see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Anybody is very welcome to share any questions or comments, so please use the Q&A function. Due to, of course, the time limits, we might not have time to get around to all of the questions today, but we thank you for your understanding on this matter. And so now I think everybody is thinking about the questions and asking, but we also have some questions for Ruiko Muto, who was our keynote speaker in the first part. So we'll also invite Ruiko first. So we'll have some questions for her first. We had one question from someone in Sendai in regards to the thyroid cancer of children in Fukushima, asking more about these families and their patients' experience with the clinical monitoring. And so they're wondering, for example, how much do they feel like they can confide in these physicians at the Fukushima Medical University, and how much do they turn to specialists outside there to receive second opinions about diagnosis and treatment? So if Ruiko could share some information about this. Thank you very much. So of course, I cannot speak on behalf of the children and their patients. You know, I'm not directly in touch with them, and I cannot speak on their behalf. But looking at the 6 young people who filed the recent lawsuit, and those who have, several of them have, of course, had relapses of their cancer. They have also had metastasis and moving, for example, to their lungs as well. In regards to the Fukushima Medical University and how much they feel that they can trust it and so on, I'm sure that it differs from person to person. But overall, well, not looking at those people, for example, who have been having treatment or diagnosis of thyroid cancer outside of the Fukushima Medical University, I think the fact that there are people who are seeking help outside as well, it shows that the trust in the Fukushima Prefecture Health Management Survey and the university is not, you know, something overall. There are, of course, people who have their concerns about it. And Ruiko, if we can ask you to stay in the panel and join the conversation from now as well, that would be great. So we have a few other questions that have been coming in. So first of all, looking at the potential of Japan joining the nuclear ban treaty, but of course, Japan's policies, you know, supporting the US nuclear weapons. So it looks like Japan at the moment has not joined the TPNW. But looking at what is the possibility for Japan to take more of a leadership role or to join the TPNW, maybe we'll first hear from Akira Kawasaki, and then we'll hear from Dave, who's also, of course, involved in ICANN as well. Thank you for this question. So the possibility of, well, there are many things that Japan can do for nuclear weapons abolition. Now that the nuclear ban treaty entered into force last year, and this year, the first meeting of states parties is going to be held. First of all, Japan participating in this meeting is an important step that we hope that the government will do. There are other countries who have not yet joined the treaty who are joining as an observer. This is possible. We're hearing from Norway, Germany, for example, including these NATO member countries who have stated that they will be joining as observers. So of course, it's not impossible for Japan to do the same. The meeting of states parties of the TPNW, well, what kind of discussions will be held there? Well, first of all, looking at, of course, the roadmap towards nuclear abolition is part of it, but also nuclear victims assistance and support will also be another important topic. This is included as a clause within the treaty itself as well, looking at how to have full victims assistance and also environmental remediation for areas that were contaminated by nuclear weapons use or testing. This is an international obligation under the treaty. And concrete discussions about these points will also be happening at the next meeting as well. Japan, of course, has an incredible amount of experience in this as the country which has the experience of victims assistance for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also what has been done, or of course not done, after the Fukushima disaster as well, including health impacts, such as we heard about after Fukushima, but also looking at the different environmental contamination and so on. Of course, we know that this is a very challenging process here in Japan from our experience here. So it's a very thankful point that this is included within the TPNW and the text itself, but there is also a risk that it is only discussed from a very narrow definition, particularly looking at what kind of victims assistance is being included in this as well. So for Japan, which has this real experience, and the nuclear survivors in Japan, voicing this experience and also having the Japanese government involved in this is a very important first step. Thank you very much. Dave, if we could have a comment about this.
Yeah, certainly. I think like Japan, Australia is a nuclear umbrella nation. We rely on the American concept of extended nuclear deterrence, the American nuclear umbrella, as a keynote in Australian policy. And so if you look, the current Australian government, the Morrison Conservative government, is very hostile to the TPNW. It was hostile to the negotiation of the treaty, and it remains hostile and says that it will not support the treaty. We have a federal election in Australia between now and mid-year. The alternative government, the Australian Labor Party, has made a commitment in 2018 and ratified in 2020 at their national conference to explore a number of aspects of the treaty, to explore its consistency with the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to explore the adequacy of verification and safeguard arrangements, and to look at the uptake of universalisation, like how popular the treaty is and who's supporting it. But the Labor Party has said that after consideration of those issues, it is committed to sign and ratify the TPNW. So we view that as a very significant thing. The alternative Australian government has a clear policy commitment to sign and ratify in government. So we will be exploring what's needed to give effect to this, given that we have a military alliance with the US and that we have US bases here, including important communications and surveillance bases in Australia. And also because Australia has now embarked on AUKUS, enhanced military cooperation arrangement with Australia, the UK and the US. We're spending 100 to 120 billion Australian dollars to get nuclear powered submarines, with considerable proliferation concerns about that. So we're trying to unpick from ICANN Australia what would need to happen and how Australia could best advance the treaty. We also are working on a call that whichever government forms government, they go as an observer to the first meeting of state parties in Vienna. And we are also working particularly with some Aboriginal people and First Nation representatives who have borne the heaviest adverse impact of nuclear weapons testing. We're looking at ways that we can advance the positive obligation dimensions of the treaty. What Akira-san mentioned about cleanup, repair, rehabilitation, recognition of impact of former testing. So there is a lot of work to be done here, but we are actually quite positive about the situation, and we believe that, you know, the potential to get Australia signing the treaty is real, and we're also very, very mindful, as everyone on this call would be, that the world we're living in now is profoundly threatened, and the situation in Ukraine with nuclear weapons on elevated alert is deeply concerning and disturbing. And we really do have to make a choice, like ICANN says, you know, we either choose to get rid of these weapons or sooner or later these weapons get rid of us. And we've made our choice, and we will be making that as strongly and clearly as possible in the context of whoever will form the next Australian government.
Thank you very much, Dave, for that response. So next we have a question for Xiting Chen from Taiwan. And so in Taiwan, it seems that, well, now that there's this clear goal for the nuclear phase out, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the energy shift situation in Taiwan.
Hello, thank you for your question. Yeah, that is a very crucial issue after the nuclear phase out, because we've been heavily rely on mostly coal and gas, natural gas. So the government in 2016, they announced energy transition pathway to move from not only nuclear, but also fossil fuel towards more renewable energy power. And the situation now is that because we've been spending so much time on the system that's heavily rely on fossil fuel and nuclear, all these centralized power system. So the transition has been really, really slow. And we've experienced a lot of challenge. Like, for example, people here, we don't have a very healthy environment for the legal structure and also for the social conversation for people to start participating in the energy transition. So people, even though we say no to nuclear, but people are not in general trust renewable energy either. There are a lot of misinformation towards renewable energy. So we have to fight the industry from nuclear and fossil fuel, but we also need to fight with the misinformation and distrust. And we need to build a positive social conversation towards building a more just energy system together with the society. So we are actually really experiencing a lot of challenging, even though for now, we don't have to fight so hard towards against nuclear, but we still have a lot of challenging because to move towards a completely different energy system, it requires a lot of drastic change in our ecology system, our energy managing system, and the mindset of the people.
Thank you very much, Xiting, for your response. There were several other questions coming, so we'll continue some other Taiwan-related questions for Xiting next as well. So we'll kind of gather them together a little bit. First of all, it seems that the public interest in nuclear power issues in Taiwan has been continued for quite a long time. Is there a particular reason for this? And also, at the time of the referendum, was there any manipulation of public opinion by pro-nuclear groups in the run-up to the referendum?
Thank you for the question. And actually, the anti-nuclear movement started in the 80s. And then around 2000, it kind of just quieted down because the history, what I mentioned in my presentation, that there's the DPP government mothballed the project for a short time and they resume it. So it was a big hit for like a big shock and big failure and a setback for the anti-nuclear movement at the time. And then it went actually pretty quiet for some time until the Fukushima catastrophe happened in 2011. So it's kind of like the movement become more like again the momentum again. So there were a lot of protests, a lot of action since the Fukushima nuclear catastrophe happened. And then it kind of quieted down again, like until 2018, like people starting to, forget about how much of an impact it caused by the nuclear catastrophe. So that's when the pro-nuclear camp initiated the referendum. Yeah, that's actually we've gone to a lot of up and downs. And regarding the second question, regarding what the pro-nuclear group have been giving out like false message, misinformation, and some propaganda. There's just so much I can't even like list. Like it's just so much there. The main argument they're making is that we need nuclear power to combat climate change, and because of the air pollution in Taiwan is bad, so we also need that to improve our air quality. So they often just put this image like either you choose nuclear or you choose getting lung cancer. So that's kind of the narrative they've been using, and it's actually working for a lot of people because they are, it's like, you know, use the strategy for people to feel fearful and making people in a place which like they feel like they have no choice, but they have to choose nuclear. So that's one of the main strategy that they've been using.
Thank you for this very clear response and information that you've shared. And as Xiting mentioned as well, the March 11 disaster in some ways was a time for sort of new movement or conversation about this. And the speaker from Germany also mentioned as well how the Fukushima disaster really had a big impact on, you know, the opinions and debate in Germany. But at the same time, looking at the situation here in Japan, as Ruiko Muto mentioned, that it's almost like people are trying to hide over the fact that the disaster happened. There's a lot of propaganda really trying to make it forget and seem that it's something that's completely finished. So I'd like to ask Ruiko, looking at this danger or the risk now we have of, you know, people forgetting about the disaster, if you could speak a little bit more about that. And we'd like to ask either Akira or Kako, as the Hibakusha, the A-bomb survivors, and also nuclear test survivors. We heard the message from youth in the Marshall Islands today. But as nuclear weapons and test victims are becoming older, and you know, their opportunity to hear their voices directly. But now we're seeing, you know, these young people in the Pacific, in Japan, raising their voices and standing up, looking at how to exchange or pass on these voices over generations. I wonder if you could share about what kind of activities other young people around you are involved in. So we'll go from the end of the table and go from Ruiko-san first. So within Fukushima Prefecture itself, even this looking at sort of forgetting about or making it seem like the disaster is completely over, it's something from the past. This is something that even from right after the disaster, looking at this something to, you know, replacing the previous myth that nuclear power is safe, this new myth that radiation doesn't have an impact, that it's not dangerous as well. And this is something, there was really this, you know, storms of this within Fukushima as well. And I think that has had a really strong impact. So for example, someone I know said that, you know, as a result of calling under the Freedom of Information to have information come out, looking at the different agencies of the Japanese government and the Fukushima Prefecture government as well, different projects that they had been contracting out to advertising agencies such as Dentsu, you know, a huge PR company. And there were actually more than 150 different projects with, you know, huge amounts of money being put, billions being put into these. And looking at, you know, for example, let's eat things from Fukushima to support people from Fukushima, these kind of campaigns about supporting by these kind of methods. Or recently also the Ministry of the Environment has what they call a dialogue forum for youth. And within this, a lot of the conversation is also looking at, you know, Fukushima and the future environment, or, you know, it's catch copy, it's phrases that are really, you know, catching, they're things that are very appealing to people as well. And so, you know, I'm not sure which advertising agency was responsible for it, but in Okuma town, right near the nuclear power plants, when there was a new building being made there were people, or the staff members at the sort of local government offices wore shirts that said on their back, well, if you have time to look back, you should just be looking forward instead. So really making people not look at what happened, not look at what's still going on, and just look at the future, trying to cover over what happened and make it seem like it's all safe and positive in the future as well. And I think this is all having an impact. Thank you very much. So we'll hear from Kako next. Thank you very much. And for me also, the hibakusha from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as more of them are, are passing on, and those who are still with us are becoming much older, we as the younger generation really need to take action. I feel this very strongly. As someone growing up in Hiroshima, the kind of peace education that we go through is about, well, what the impacts of radiation are, what can that do to your body, also discrimination and these kind of things, how radiation impacts your whole lives as well, is something that we really taught quite a lot as students in Hiroshima. But when I moved out of Hiroshima, when I meet with students from other parts of the country, I realized that, oh, well, what we had learned is only in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Students from other part of Japan don't learn about these impacts of radiation, or don't learn about really what this meant in a different way. I really realized this after I moved out of Hiroshima. And this is why I think looking at the importance of education is so important, I believe. The voices of the hibakusha, of the atomic bomb survivors, the nuclear survivors, even if we cannot hear from them directly anymore in the future, there is so much that they have left for us. And so we need to make sure that this is remembered, that this legacy is taken on, and that we are maintaining this as well. The impacts of radiation, whether it's nuclear energy, nuclear weapons, but, well, how are friends of my own generation, how much are they aware of them on an everyday basis? Of course, not so much is the answer. But looking at, well, it's not that they're completely not worried or completely not interested. It's not that they, if you ask them, well, do you think we should have nuclear weapons or not? Of course, they feel like we shouldn't. But there are people who perhaps they're interested in other social issues, but not so much aware of nuclear issues, for example. So I think it's really important for us to show how all of these issues are connected. And this is really, I think, what us as a way to bring more young people involved is to show how all of these different issues are connected, and with the voices of the survivors, with the voices of the people who are still suffering from the Fukushima disaster, from nuclear issues all around the world. I think this is what we really need to work towards. And I think that this is something that we can all do together as well. Thank you very much. And in December last year, we organized the World Nuclear Survivors Forum online as Peace Boat, together with partners from all around the world impacted by both nuclear weapons, nuclear testing, people from, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and from the Marshall Islands, of course, MISA for the Pacific, who we heard from previously, also were a great partner in this. Also people, First Nations communities from Australia impacted by uranium mining, as Dave introduced as well. Within the program, we didn't directly have speakers from Fukushima or Chernobyl on the day, but we had this World Nuclear Survivors Forum in December, and looking at how to convey these voices around the world. This was also done in partnership with ICANN, but looking at the meeting of states parties coming up very soon and how we're preparing for this, how we can share the information about the situation of nuclear survivors. So the forum was also a step towards that. And one thing I really felt speaking with people from the Pacific and other nuclear survivors as well is that, well, who do we mean when we talk about the victims or the survivors? In the sense of Japan, when we say survivors, it's, the people who directly experienced the A-bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example, and they're passing on. How do we pass on their direct testimonies is the way that it's often looked at in Japan. But really, when we speak, of course, such as from the youth from the Marshalls that we spoke about before, of course, it's not only the first generation who are the victims of nuclear weapons, the second generation, the next generations as well. They didn't perhaps firsthand witness the nuclear testing in the 1950s, but that does not mean that they are also victims of this. When you hear from them, of course, you hear about the ongoing situation. And, of course, we know that it's not easy to hear directly from the first generation, but from people in the Pacific, we don't really hear that the memories of the first generation are being forgotten about or passed away. And I think the reason for this is because the nuclear testing impacts are across the whole of society, of course, including environmental aspects, the ongoing impacts of the radiation that is still there in the environment and is still very serious today, but also other impacts still continuing within society today, looking under the issue of ongoing colonialism related issues as well as all part of these structures. And this is still something which is very much ongoing today. So I really feel that if the first, we don't hear necessarily from people from the Pacific saying, well, when the first generation survivors are no longer here, it will be difficult for us to carry on this method. This is something still so ongoing. And it's also so directly related to the climate issue for people in the Pacific. We really hear, and they very naturally show how these issues are all connected. And I think perhaps that's somewhat different from the situation here in Japan. I think in Japan, we still perhaps separate things a little bit. And so I think this new generation, as represented by Kako as well, who is, of course, someone who is from Hiroshima, so maybe this comes to her naturally in a way, but really having more spaces showing these are connected, showing that also this is something that we really need to examine from within the experience of the Fukushima disaster as well. These impacts are still going on today, and looking at how we can connect this to the future creation of society as well. Of course, not only looking at the narrow definition of how do we continue to pass on the testimonies of those experienced it firsthand in the first generation, I think we need to broaden this issue much more. Thank you very much for those responses. Within this discussion, I wonder if any of the other speakers have something they want to add. Maybe Dave, if you want to add anything to this.
I think that was a very powerful point that has been made by Kako about interconnectedness. I think we really need to see and build a sense that these threats are twinned. The doomsday clock, which measures humanity's proximity to extinction, is at 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been, even in the coldest parts of the Cold War. And it's at that level for the twin threats of unchecked climate change and nuclear weapons. And I really do think we need to find language and forms that translates, particularly to young people now, that links the climate and the nuclear threat. The nuclear is not a solution to climate. It actually threatens it more and more, both militarily and with a defunct or an underperforming and very expensive, misleading solution. So that's really important, I think, to do that, and to bring with it and possibly one small positive or small opportunity from the sadness and the very disturbing situation in Ukraine, is that there will be people around the world now reminded that nuclear weapons exist, because often they're kept in the back and they're not mentioned in the public realm. We're seeing the weaponization of civil nuclear reactors. We're seeing the threatened use of military nuclear weapons. Maybe one thing that could come out of this tragic situation is an increased awareness and increased activity about the need to put an end to both the civil and military dimensions of nuclear technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Shiting, do you want to add anything to this? Oh, actually, we have Ryuko first, and then we'll come to Shiting after. If I can add on top of this, from the perspective in Fukushima and the voices of young people, I think we're starting to hear them really more and more. I think people who were very young at the time of the nuclear disaster, who were still children, who are now, becoming older, and looking at, of course, such as the people who are involved in the 311 Thyroid Children's Fund, the young people who are now standing up, sharing their experiences, or also who have evacuated to other places as well, and who are now have grown up a little bit more, who are still very young children at the time of the disaster, but looking at them speaking out more in symposiums and so on as well. And of course, the young people who have filed the lawsuit against TEPCO as well, who were between 6 and 16 years old at the time of the disaster. So within this kind of situation, I think that more young people being able to raise their voices is something which I think is really something very powerful. And the fact that to make sure that they are not suffering from bashing, that they are not suffering from different attacks, I think it's our responsibility to look at how we can support them and to create the kind of environment where they can continue to speak out. And so I think, for example, looking at the links with, the young people who are working on climate issues and these kind of things as well, and create these kind of joint issues, joint movements, and connect together even more, I think would be very important. Thank you very much. Thank you, Luiko, for that comment. So we'll go on to the next question then. And Dave also mentioned, the issue, of course, that, nuclear power plants can become, weapons in the situation. We look at what's happening with Russian invasion in Ukraine at the moment, and the attacks and the dangers of nuclear power plants are really becoming very clear to many more people, I think. But looking at attacks during wartime on nuclear power plants is something which, of course, people, didn't really imagine that happened. But I'm not sure if someone could imagine, why this is not something in planning. So looking at these security risks around nuclear weapons, maybe Akira will respond to this. So, well, I don't think it's necessarily that nobody imagined this. I think in discussions around nuclear security, this is something which is, on the agenda, looking at terrorist groups, non-state armed groups, attacks on nuclear weapons, nuclear power plants is something which is discussed in simulations and so on. And I think this is the case in Ukraine, but I think really looking at whether expecting such a direct attacks as we are really seeing what's happening in Ukraine is, of course, not something that anybody expected, but looking at scenarios about what to do if there is an armed attack and simulations or plans and so on is something which I think people will be seeing that if this is not done even more seriously than it has been in the past, it's immense risks that are being faced now as well, I think is very clear. And so, as was mentioned by many speakers in part one in the relay talks as well, after the Fukushima disaster, looking at, for example, local governments in places which are host to nuclear power plants, seeing the fact that they are home or hosting somewhere which is very dangerous. What would happen if there is some kind of a conflict or some kind of attack? I think more people being opposed to nuclear power plants from this perspective. But I think if Japan does continue to use nuclear power, I think this kind of security is also something which really needs to be very much more seriously considered even than it has in the past. Thank you. Thank you for that comment. Did anybody else want to add something to that? If not, we'll move to the next.
I would, if I might just quickly add one thing, which is that that apart from the fact of direct attack on a nuclear facility, one of the key vulnerabilities of nuclear facilities is that they require constant electricity and water supply to ensure that there's cooling operations. Now, we see routinely in conflicts that antagonists attempt to reduce the warfighting capacity of the other side by taking out their civilian infrastructure, their water, their power, their transport. Now, it mightn't even be a considered attack on a nuclear facility. It could be the unintended consequence of taking out essential civil infrastructure. So I think what we're seeing in the Ukraine is that the biggest threat in that area is uncontrolled radiation release, either from nuclear weapons, which has been threatened, from compromised nuclear facilities, which we've seen at Chernobyl and Zaporizhia, or from untracked and uncontrolled nuclear material, including a shipment of Australian uranium, which went over in April 2021, and which has now effectively disappeared off the radar. So of all those threats, they're all nuclear, they're all related, and of all the energy sources in the world, nuclear is the one that has the most unique, most problematic, and the most easily weaponized dimensions. So I think your question about security and defense planning and forward thinking and future proofing energy systems, renewables give a greater degree of national independence, they give a greater degree of energy security, and they greatly reduce the threat of having a pre-deployed terrorist target in one's homeland. So I think there should be a really strong call from the nuclear free movement that renewables are not only sensible for the planet, they're sensible for security and defense posture, and they're a safer and fundamentally more peaceful form of energy.
Thank you very much for that addition, Dave. And yeah, exactly, really, as you've said, and looking at the Fukushima disaster, of course, as well, the loss of power there was a huge factor there. Maybe Ruiko has a comment to add? Maybe not. Okay, so we'll continue. We'll have time for maybe a couple more questions. We have some which have come from here in the venue as well. Looking, of course, the issue of what to do with nuclear waste, I think, is one of the fundamental questions. Looking at, first of all, to make sure that we don't increase the amount of waste which already exists and have a clear path towards that, but also looking at, well, what we do with nuclear waste and so on. If there's any recent or up-to-date information on this. So first of all, how looking at all countries with nuclear facilities, of course, have this shared issue of nuclear waste. I'm not sure if someone wants to make a comment about that. Anybody, either online or in person? So we'll start with Ruiko and then move from her. So nuclear waste is, of course, something which is continuing to increase day by day in the world. But first of all, looking at how to stop, how to make sure that there is no further increase in, so let's stop nuclear power plant operations so that we at least don't have an increase in this as the first step. And then to consider how we store this from now, how we resolve this issue. But the first step, just looking at how we can stop an increase in the first place, I think is very important. Thank you, Ruiko. And I think, yes, exactly as you say, if any other, I wonder if we could hear about the discussion either maybe in Taiwan first, Cheating, if you have an issue about nuclear waste that you could share with us.
I just want to say the situation here in Taiwan is very challenging because we don't even have a nuclear waste act for choosing, citing the final disposal site for our high-level waste. So we haven't even started the siting yet. And in the first referendum, the majority of the people voted for continue using nuclear, but ironically, in several polls, more than 70% of the Taiwanese citizens, they say that they don't want nuclear waste in their city or county. So this is a really big issue that, like, the people here don't realize how much of a responsibility that is for everyone. And our government hasn't really started the work for dealing with it, the waste responsibility with the responsibility they need to take. So I would say that it would be really our main goal, not only pushing the government, but also having conversation with the citizen here in Taiwan.
Thank you very much for that comment from Taiwan. I wonder if anyone else wants to say anything about this. Maybe Akira will next. Yes, thank you very much. Nuclear waste, of course, the current situation is that there is no clear solution to this. But one thing, well, first of all, looking at the issue of siting for disposal sites for high-level waste is something which is often pushed on more vulnerable areas as well, is something, the structures we are seeing happening in many places. But I think if we look at really what's immediate, looking at the disposal of waste from the Fukushima nuclear disaster, I think that's a very immediate issue that we have to find a resolution here in Japan. And this is what brings us to the issue of the contaminated water, for example. Watching the messages before as well and seeing this message, from the Pacific, for example, looking at how serious this issue is for them, I think is something so important for us to recognize as well. Not only people from the Marshall Islands, of course, but from different countries throughout the Pacific as well. This issue of the contaminated water is something very serious for them. We need to understand that. And also, this is something that I've been told in meetings in person, of course, with people from the Pacific and through these kind of statements we're hearing. And I think the fact that this is not being brought into the discussion more here in Japan is a big problem. At the very least, it's often only we hear about voices from, for example, Korea or China, the neighboring very close countries. And it's often presented in a particular way there as well. But looking at this issue of disposing of nuclear waste, this water in the Pacific is something which, of course, there are the legal obligations, but also the accountability in terms of dialogue, in terms of explanation and so on as well. And not only to the countries only within 100 kilometers, but, these further within the shared Pacific as well. And, this issue of people saying, oh, maybe it should just be done further out in the Pacific, for example, this kind of thing is a huge problem. And so looking at this issue, when we consider, territory from the perspective of the Pacific example, of course, there is the small land part of the island, but when we consider their area of living, of working and so on, it's not only this land area as well, but this ocean area is such a huge part of their life, of their livelihoods. And we, as an island nation, as Japan, need to understand that better and need to recognize that better as well. That the concept of where is being impacted is something we need to think about so much more seriously here in Japan as well. Thank you for that comment. We still have a little bit more time, so we'll have a couple more questions. I'll have a couple of questions next that I'll gather, and then we'll go for a comment from each of our panelists to close. I think the first one is probably a question for Ruiko, but the Japanese government, the Fukushima Prefecture, UNSCARE, and so on, are claiming that the thyroid cancer being found in Fukushima children is not related to the disaster. Why do you think such a situation has happened? So that's a question for Ruiko. The second is perhaps a question for Shiting or Dave. But this question is also about the Japanese government is underplaying the negative impacts of radiation, making it seem like the disaster's already finished, the impacts are not going on, and they're having a lot of these kind of messaging or propaganda. And as Rico mentioned, there's a lot about, the advertising of the Agency of Reconstruction and so on. But how is this seen from overseas? Is this kind of information being conveyed to your communities, your countries? And if it is, in what kind of way is it being seen, the Japanese government's messaging? So we'll hear from Ruiko first. So just the other day, actually, the Fukushima Medical University, there was a symposium held, and so from 9:30 in the morning till 5 p.m., a full day. And I wasn't able to be there right until the end, but I heard most of the day's discussions. And within this, as the UN Scientific Committee and so on, seeing this as UNSCARE being very trustworthy, that's where all the most accurate information is. And also that rather than the impacts, or they really talked mostly about psychological impacts of the disaster. And so looking at, the Fukushima nuclear disaster and the thyroid cancers are not connected. This is the statement that they kept over and over and over again throughout the day, really repeating. And, it was very difficult to be listening to this over and over again throughout the whole day. But why it is that they're not recognizing these health impacts, I think what's fundamentally the issue here is if these impacts are acknowledged, then it will, of course, make people worried about the reoperating of nuclear power plants, but also potentially for those people who also want Japan to have a discussion about potentially even having its own nuclear program as well. It would, cut that off as well. So I think these kind of factors are in the background as to why they do not want to acknowledge any health impacts, that for these kind of political interests, it's sort of more in their favor just to, right from the beginning, deny any causality or health connections. And even though this reality, close to 300 children have the reality of being diagnosed with thyroid cancer, of suffering from this, but how they are able to reinterpret this reality in a way that's just convenient for themselves is something which I also struggle with every day. But unfortunately, that's the kind of current situation that is here in Japan. So looking at how to, of course, looking at scientific proof and so on about this is one point, but even beyond that as well, I think for us as citizens level, what we can do on our level to say that usually there would only be 1 or 2 children in a million in Japan would have thyroid cancer, but the fact that there's been close to 300, calling for them to look into the reasons for this, to have a full investigation. I think as citizens, rather than it being on us to show the scientific proof, it's about us to call for a full investigation. just thinking about this situation is really, of course, it's wrong. And there's so many other things since the Fukushima disaster which are in the same kind of thing, what we've experienced. Why are things happening like this? Why is the situation as it is? So many questions every day about the overall situation. So looking at how we can continue to call for the truth and the facts to be made public, and to call for more information, and for us to have access to this information as well. And when something is wrong, to be able to say that something is wrong is what I think that we need to continue to speak out about. Sorry, it's not such a conclusion, but thank you. Thank you, Riko. So we'll hear from Dave and then Shiting about how the Japanese government's propaganda is being seen from overseas. Either one of you, feel free to jump in.
Maybe I will just quickly at the first. I think it in many ways the terrestrial propaganda is working. Like the Tokyo Olympics were watched avidly in Australia with scant reference to Fukushima or continuing problems. Aquatically, the Japanese government's positioning is not working. There is real awareness and concern here of the direct disposal of liquid waste into the Pacific Ocean. We're a Pacific nation as well, and we feel that, we're aware of that. And so that is the optics, the look, the sense of that is that from a general, if you like, as much as one can, a general Australian citizen perspective, is that they seem to have sorted what's happening on the land, and it's a problem what's happening at sea. I think there's one other thing that is consistent though in the Australian perception of Fukushima, which is that Australians have a high regard for Japanese engineering, technology and systems. We think Japanese is a very sophisticated manufacturing country. And therefore, when nuclear power went so badly wrong in such a rich and technically gifted and developed nation, what that has done in Australia has changed some of that perception of like it only goes wrong in countries like the former Soviet Union. And there are now people in Australia that look at Japan as a sophisticated developed nation that was not able to ensure the safety of its citizens from a power source used that was meant to be for the benefit of its citizens. And there's a bit of a question of, well, if Japan can't do it, you wouldn't want many other countries adopting this. It's a risky way of making power. So I think that would be the Australian perception. If Japan can't do it, don't touch it. They shouldn't dump it in the water. And I think it's reasonably sorted on land. We know that that's not the case, but I think that's the thread of how I would read the Australian mood.
For the situation in Taiwan, I think most of the people here, they are not aware of the actual situation in Japan. They are not aware that the catastrophe is still going on, especially because of the pro-nuclear camp here who initiated 2 referendum to continue using nuclear power here. They even visit Fukushima themselves and made videos of them like eating the fruit in Fukushima and visiting the locals. So they're trying to, simplify the complicated situation in Fukushima and trying to say that everything is perfect now, everything's recovered, and they're accusing the anti-nuclear campaigner here in Taiwan, saying that we are discriminating people in Japan by revealing the situation for the contamination, for example. Like they are trying to accuse us and they are pretending to somehow saying that they are like to say that Japan is fully recovered is helping them in some way. So the situation is very ironic, but I don't think it's very successful because of what Dave was saying, the situation with the contaminated water, and also the people in Japan, including a lot of environmental group and the fishermen group in Japan, they keep raising their voice against the unjust situation and keep telling the truth of what's happening. So I think that also made an impact in our fight in Taiwan against nuclear power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Xiting, for that message. So we're coming up to the end of today, so we'll get into a little bit of a conclusion. But what I'd like to ask everyone as our last question, of course, as we're facing many different crises and there's so much uncertainty as well, but within that, we really feel the significance of international solidarity. Nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, climate change, they're all global issues. What kind of solidarity do you find hope in? So we'd like to ask that as the last question. So we also have a question from Kako as well. You mentioned about a global day of action at the end of this month. I wonder if you could speak about how that might be connected to the nuclear energy issue as well. So if you could include that in your response. And of course, for any of you, if there's anything that you wanted to say but you missed out on, or you want to share as your final message, feel free to share that as well. So we'll start from the table in Tokyo. So we have Xiting Tian and Dave Sweeney joining us internationally here today. So it's almost like we can simply connect across borders now. Of course, there was a lot of preparation that went in, but that we can have these conversations internationally is something so important. Now that 11 years have passed since the Fukushima disaster, I think, this is something that we wouldn't have been able to imagine before, that having people from different parts of the world come together to talk about these dangers of nuclear power together, compare the situation in our different contexts, hearing about the issues, in Australia, these connecting in this way. Of course, the technological development is one part of what has made this possible. But not only this, I think it's so important that we can connect in these ways now as well. We can compare these different experiences, perspectives, when we look at the release of the contaminated water into the Pacific, for example, or food export regulations. Hearing about these perspectives of what the situation is in different countries and contexts, comparing and exchanging, is something that shows that nuclear energy is something that we really need to think about from these international perspectives. And I think that we could really feel that very strongly today. And I think continuing this in the future is also very important. So we'll continue on along the table in Tokyo. So looking at international solidarity, I also truly feel is very important. Fridays for Future, of course, having our global days of simultaneous action is really the reason for this, to emphasize these international connections. So hearing about how the Global Day of Action on Climate can connect together with the anti-nuclear power movement as well. In this month's action, we're also going to be having a photo action joined together. And also you can have, saying a message, stop. You can say, stop climate change, stop nuclear power, and so on. And it's a way actually imitating road signs is what we're going to be doing as part of this campaign, having people having their stop signs for what they want to stop. And so we hope that all of you can join this action that we're planning as well, including issues of nuclear energy too. And we'll hear from Ruiko next. Thank you. Really today, having this opportunity to connect with people from other countries today, both the speakers and the audience, and also people connecting from Zoom from all over Japan as well, is something really important for us, making sure that we realize none of us can survive on our own. We're not alone. We're always living in our connections with other people, whether it's, people being in Japan connected with people in other countries and all around the world, but also humanity itself is also connected with all other living beings within this broad cycle together. Of course, sometimes, you can think about, well, maybe humanities shouldn't even be here. We're the ones making all the problems. But going beyond that, looking at how we're all living on this planet together, we're all living creatures, and we are one of those, and how we are connected in this way within this cycle. And therefore, things that the responsibility that we have within this cycle is there. Our responsibility to other living beings is something that I think we always need to keep in mind as well. And I think if we can keep that in mind and connect with people and with living beings all around the world is so important. And it's something which is within our possibility as well. Thank you so much for the experience to join today. Thank you, Rico. So we'll go Dave first and then Shiting.
Yeah, I think Fukushima has really shown us how independent we are. Radiation doesn't need a passport to travel, and we're highly interdependent and connected. I think this has been a really important forum. As people have said, it's a really uncertain and challenging times. We've got climate chaos, escalated nuclear threats, and a continuing global pandemic. So it's a very tough time, and it is really important to connect and to look after each other and ourselves and to build hope. Ground truth, powerful hope. You asked the question about hope. I get a lot of hope from ICANN, as Akira and many people know who are actively involved in this. This was an initiative of ordinary people who collectively have combined to do some pretty extraordinary things. The job is there to be done, but we have now fashioned ourselves the tools to do it with. I'm really pleased personally to have been able to be part of this, to be part of honouring and responding. And I also look forward to being part of building a more secure and inclusive energy future. I'm particularly aware of that given the direct Australian uranium connection to Fukushima. So you can be sure that there'll be many in Australia, talking about solidarity, there'll be many in Australia on this Friday who'll be taking action in the streets, who'll be taking some sort of reflective action, lighting candles, doing vigils, doing stuff. So like was said, we're not alone and you are not alone. And I think it's a really important time. And I really wanted to thank all the people that made this possible, the interpreters, the people that made all the technical things happen, the audience and the relay talkers, the panelists, particularly the organisers, Fo Japan and Peace Boat. It's a really powerful and positive thing to have done. So thanks very much. And we will be actively reaching out across that water on Friday.
Thank you so much, Dave. And Shiting.
For me, for our campaign Taiwan, I think it's so important to recognize and learn from the experience from so many people, so many groups in different countries that's working towards a better future. For example, the people in Fukushima, as far as I know, there are so many like new, small, decentralized power work for power, decentralized, small and community-based power company that's been growing. And that's so encouraging for us to see that the people who suffer the impact, they are building back their life better. And for example, people in South Korea, their government is very pro-nuclear, but in some city like Seoul, they have initiative like one less nuclear power plant. They are saving electricity and be more efficient to replace the one reactor, nuclear reactor. So these different efforts, different action, different initiative that's happening all around the world, I think it's just really important for us to learn from them. And I think to learn from each other and to see like everyone, they are contribute and they're building alternative future for a better future. That I think that's just so important and encouraging. I think we can all learn from each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your words, both of you. So we'll close the panel discussion now. We're right on time to end, but thank you so much to our panel, to our four panelists, and also of course, Rico, our keynote speaker from part one, and everyone else who's joined us today. Really thanks to all of you. And to close, we'll have final words from Akira Kawasaki, one of the co-organizers of today as well. on behalf of Peaceboat. Thank you so much. I think I already spoke quite a lot in the panel discussion, so I'll be brief, but I'll just share some words to finish up our session today. Today's event, within the discussions we've heard today, looking at how to connect beyond borders, beyond issues, really realizing how important this is. And it was such a reminder for all of us. Of course, we have technological development, but also under these very peculiar circumstances of COVID has maybe forced us to learn these different tools and ways to connect with each other as well. Of course, well, it's not possible to have many people gathering together physically in the same place, but we've had hundreds of people joining us today online. So here in person in Japan, but also many people around the world, we can really see many diverse voices being able to be shared today, which I'm so happy about today as well. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers, people who have been involved in the organizing today, and also those, of course, in the different preparations until now as well, both the staff and volunteers. Thank you to everybody involved. And within the connections to this, thinking about, well, what we can really see as an issue in common is, well, sharing these, recognizing that these are together, and to think about the suffering, the pain, the sadness that is behind all of these experiences. It's not just, we're hearing these words saying, oh, recovery, reconstruction, the Olympics, but, this is not the situation for really the reality of people in the disaster impacted areas and those who have had to move away. People saying it's safe, but people's safety is really not being secured at all and provided, and the results are irreversible. At the same time, this is happening now in Ukraine. We see as well this stories of war being spoke more, and people talk about which country started or which country won or lost or this kind of thing. But of course, the people who are suffering are those people who are there on the ground. It's these citizens, it's these people. We're continuing these efforts every year as we can, but really remembering these people who are suffering but not able to raise their voices, who are not in a position where they can stand out, to make sure that we can listen to them, that we can amplify them, that we can make their suffering visible, their situation visible. I think this is our task for all of us. So I hope that we can continue to connect and work together. Thank you so much, and let's continue. Thank you. Thank you very much, Akira Kawasaki, for these closing words. And we have just a few other pieces of notices from today. We had a 3.5-hour event today. It was quite a long program, so thank you so much for everybody who joined us today. Today, we have had both here in person in Tokyo and also online, 340 people joining today's program. So thank you to each and every one of you. The nuclear impacts, the nuclear power plant situation is continuing all around the world, and the impacts of the disaster are still ongoing. But at the same time, looking for the actions of citizens calling for an end to nuclear power, to nuclear weapons, and connecting these with other issues as well is something where we are taking steps. We are still facing many crises, but I think new perspectives, new ideas, voices that we've heard today, we can take with us in our actions towards a nuclear-free world from now as well. And those of you who are joining on Zoom today, you will have a link for a questionnaire to have your thoughts about today. We really look forward to your thoughts. We will also be making public some of the materials and also the archive of today as well. Those of you who are here in person, we're also handing out a survey, so we thank you for your cooperation in that as well. And so once again, we would like to thank all of our speakers today, everybody who provided a video message, everybody who made a relay talk, and also the organizers, the tech staff, and also the interpreters who joined today as well. It was our great pleasure to be able to spend this time together with you, and we look together to, in solidarity with all people around the world working on these issues. Once again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today.